Hello, romance lovers. Today I have a story for you called I Am the Emperor's Lost Daughter. Don't forget to support this video with a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new interesting stories. Thank you for watching. The girl was quite scared. She had a worried look. Her eyes were a soft blue color and her hair was white with a small fringe. Her name was Rosette. She was born and left an orphan, having lost her parents in her early childhood. She was taken in by the Duke of Humphrey, where she grew up among other servants. From a very young age, she worked as a maid, running errands and taking care of the cleanliness of the Duke's house. However, fate turned out to be cruel. The girl was accused of a murder she did not commit. Now she faces execution, and no one is in a hurry to stand up for her. She stood on the wooden platform, her hands clenched into fists, and looked at the people standing on the ground below her, their faces distorted with anger, and they screamed furiously, demanding execution. One man stood in the front row, his face stern and his eyes full of hatred. He had short chestnut-colored hair and a long mustache. He shouted to the whole city, accusing the girl of being a demoness who had killed the Duke. The girl looked at the man with disappointment. His accusations pierced her, but she quietly denied his words, barely moving her lips. Her face looked tired, as if she had long ago lost the strength to fight injustice. Suddenly, the girl felt a sharp pain in her head, as if someone had hit her on the crown with an invisible hand. The pain was so strong that she could not hold back the scream that burst from her chest. The man continued to shout, ordering the girl to be quiet. He continued that they had enough of her false illusions and meaningless words about her supposedly being a reincarnated soul who had returned to this world. But the girl, with tears in her eyes, understood that she had never said these words. She felt her heart squeezed with disappointment because no one would believe her. A feeling of helplessness grew in her soul, but it had always been like that. Her words were not heard. Her feelings were not taken into account. Her whole world consisted of invisible walls, behind which no one knew the truth. In her home empire of Stan, there is an ancient legend about reincarnates, souls that are believed to return to this world. These people, according to legend, remember their past life in another world. They have knowledge and abilities that seem supernatural. They can also display the power of manifestation, an unusual ability to summon objects from other worlds. This power allows them to summon objects, weapons, or magical artifacts. The reincarnated come through 3 stages. The first does not allow them to summon objects, but allows them to show illusions about other worlds. At the second stage, the reincarnated are already able to summon objects, but only small ones. These objects usually have a symbolic meaning or serve to enhance their magical abilities. People of the third stage have full powers of manifestation and can summon huge objects from other worlds. These can be weapons, magical artifacts, or even entire buildings that they used in their past lives. These people always received recognition from the people because their abilities were so impressive that they became objects of admiration and respect. And usually those who reincarnated brought benefit to the whole world. Using their knowledge and power, they helped solve important problems, restore balance, and protect the world from threats. And for some reason, our girl got the power of incarnation, which scared the others a little. Her abilities appeared unexpectedly. However, the reincarnated are distinguished by another feature, memories of another world, which give them an understanding of their purpose and past. The girl did not have these memories. That is why the girl never claimed that she was reborn. She just wanted to get some love by showing off her abilities. She wasn't looking for fame or recognition. She didn't need worship or fear. It was the only way to demonstrate the power of embodiment, which soon became the root of all her problems. The little girl looked at the maid with fear as she raised her hand, holding a small bird that she had summoned with her power of manifestation. The bird was delicate and fragile, with bright feathers that trembled slightly at her touch. The maid angrily hit the girl and she fell to the floor, screaming in pain. The maid angrily shouted that these were damn illusions and ordered the girl to stop immediately. Her voice was full of rage and despair. The girl was still standing on the platform. Her eyes were tired and full of despair. Suddenly, a sharp cry was heard, and someone turned to her. She turned her head in the direction of the sound. Her eyes caught the figure standing in front of her. He said that she used vicious illusion techniques to fake reincarnation and deceive people. He held a large axe in his hands, and the mask covering his face gave him the appearance of an invincible judge. His words sounded decisive, like a sentence, and his masked figure seemed sinister, creating an atmosphere of menace and fear. She looked at him, scared, her heart pounding. The girl hadn't done this, hadn't used any vicious illusion techniques. Confusion and fear were evident in her eyes. He continued, stating that when her tricks failed, she killed the Duke with her witchcraft. The girl closed her eyes in pain and rage, realizing that it was a lie. She had never harmed the Duke. He asked her if she would admit her sins, but the girl knew that no one would believe her if she denied the accusations. Her heart was filled with despair. Rosetta knew that her fate had already been decided, and any words spoken in defense would only make her situation worse. And suddenly she heard a scream as they ordered her to be executed. These words pierced her like a knife in the heart, and only one thought flashed through her mind. It was all over. Suddenly, she was grabbed by the arms from both sides by the knights. The girl was terribly frightened, and this was clear from the expression on her face. Her body was tensed with fear, and her heart was beating wildly, as if it was about to burst out of her chest. She was pushed to a place where a hatch opened on the platform, and she saw a bunch of black snakes in front of her. They were hissing, their eyes were glowing red, as if they were living monsters ready to pounce on her. They were terrifying in appearance, their scales glowing with an ominous black light, and every hissing sound they made seemed to cut the air. Their eyes glowed red, like evil lights in the darkness. Panic gripped her, and she felt cold sweat start to form on her forehead. The snake's gaze was always sinister, and she knew that there was only death before her. The girl was terrified. She knew that she would definitely not survive the bites of these snakes, that her death would be quick and painful. Panic bubbled in her chest, and she, unable to control herself, screamed. She begged for someone, anyone, to come to her aid, to save her. Suddenly, a bright light began to emanate from her tied hands, which surprised her. The light grew brighter, as if it was not her power, but something much more powerful and unknown. The girl froze, forgetting about everything, including fear and pain. Suddenly, as if in an illusion, a gloomy 9-story apartment engulfed in flames appeared before the girl. Flames licked its walls, and smoke rose into the sky, hiding part of the building. There was a bustle all around. The fire department was on site. Firefighters were fighting the fire, and an ambulance was standing, ready to leave. The girl didn't understand what kind of place this was. Everything was so alien and absurd that she couldn't believe her eyes. The flames, the firefighters, the ambulance. None of it made sense. It didn't look like her world, like nothing she'd ever seen. The woman was kneeling in front of the burning apartment, crying and screaming someone's name. Her voice was shrill and full of pain, breaking the silence of the night. Firefighters were bustling around her, trying to calm her down. The girl looked at this picture, and her heart sank with pain. She felt someone else's grief as keenly as if it were her own. The woman's crying, the fire consuming the building, and the helplessness of the people around her caused a heavy feeling of loss in her soul. She didn't understand what was happening. Were they looking for someone? This thought haunted her, making her peer even more closely at what was happening. The girl tried to make sense of the screams and fuss, but the scene before her was too alien and chaotic to comprehend. Inside the apartment, everything was knocked down and destroyed. The charred walls crumbled, the furniture was reduced to rubble, and the flames continued to devour everything in their path. The fire roared like a living creature, throwing out sparks and enveloping everything in thick black smoke. The fallen bricks lay in a disordered row, like the last trace of a destroyed wall. They were charred and covered in ash, and between them smoldered pieces of wood and scraps of unknown things. Through the clouds of fire and smoke, a woman in a firefighter suit hugged a little girl. Her movements were careful but determined, as if she were protecting the child from all the evil of this broken world. The woman opened her eyes as if through pain, breathing heavily. Her gaze was full of determination, despite her fatigue and fear. The girl stood aside, watching what was happening. Her gaze was confused and full of pain. She could not understand why she was seeing this. Suddenly, the girl screamed and burst into tears. Her voice, full of fear and despair, cut through the noise of the flames. She clung tightly to the woman, as if only her embrace could save her from the horror around her. The woman hugged the girl with a gentle smile, and despite everything that was happening, tried to calm her down, assuring her that everything would be fine and that she would soon be rescued. There was softness and confidence in her voice, as if she was trying to convey her strength and hope to the girl. A man was running down the stairs, his footsteps loud in the silence of the ruined building. He was calling for the girl. His voice was agitated and full of anxiety. His face was distorted with worry, and his breathing was ragged from his hurried steps. The girl screamed with all her might, her voice filled with pain and fear, but there was also determination in it. She said that they were here, pointing to the place where the disaster was happening. The girl was lying under the fallen wall. Her body was unnaturally bent, and she was struggling to breathe. Weakness overcame her, but her gaze remained wary. At this time, the guy had already entered the room where the disaster occurred. The girl, raising her hand with difficulty, handed the child to the boy, her eyes full of pain, but there was also a desperate determination in them. She ordered him to take the child and not to worry about her, as if her own fate had already been decided. The man turned to her, his face filled with determination and concern. He shouted at her to wait a moment, promising that he would return shortly. The girl smiled through the pain, and a strange sense of relief flickered in her eyes. She quietly said to herself, "What a relief." In her soul, despite the chaos around her, a tiny spark of hope arose. Suddenly, the stone above her began to crumble, breaking away from the wall with a deafening roar. It seemed that it would fall right on her. Suddenly, the girl looked up and saw a huge rock flying straight at her. Time seemed to slow down, and her gaze froze on this dangerous object that was quickly closing the distance. Rosetta watched all this, and her heart beat faster with fear. She was really scared of what was happening, not knowing what to do. The girl turned to face the floor, instinctively hugging her head with her hands, as if trying to protect herself from an imminent threat. At that moment, her body shrank with fear, and her heart pounded wildly. The girl thought that this was probably her end. Thoughts instantly filled her head, and she felt how time began to move slowly. She remembered her grandmother and wondered if she was happy with the way the girl lived. Did her grandmother feel proud of her, of her choices, of every step she took in life? An elderly woman lies in a hospital bed, her face tired and haggard, but in her eyes there is still a shadow of that inner light. The same girl sits on a chair next to her, holding her hand, tightly and carefully. The grandmother smiled faintly and, squeezing the girl's hand, told her to always help others. There was a look in her eyes, full of wisdom and care. She smiled and said that, just like them, they should help others when they need support. The girl sat next to her grandmother, her eyes full of tears. She quietly held her hand, unable to hide the pain and bitterness. But in her heart, there was a feeling of gratitude for every moment spent together. The girl thought that she had kept her word. She had always tried to help others, as her grandmother had taught her, and despite all the difficulties, she felt that she had done everything she could. She closed her eyes against the weight, feeling the pain and fatigue wash over her. Everything seemed too heavy at that moment, and she tried to find some peace, allowing herself to let go of the inner tension for just a moment. She thought that she could now face her grandmother with confidence, knowing that she had kept her word and done all she could. There was a lightness in this realization, as if she had already prepared herself for the next step, for saying goodbye, but with peace in her heart. Rosetta watched all this and never ceased to be amazed. She saw how the girl became stronger with each passing moment, despite the pain and loss, and suddenly she found herself on the platform again, where she was being held by two knights with her hands tied. Everything around her began to seem unreal, and the girl realized that what she had seen was just a vision. Suddenly, the girl realized that this was her past life. This whole moment, all the experiences she had, were not just random images, but part of her own history. She also realized that she was not a fake. All of her experiences, her strength, and her desire to help others were real, and she was not someone who was just trying to pretend to be someone else. But all the people who stood in front of the platform demanded the execution of the fake. That is, her. Despite her awareness that she was not a fake, fear and despair squeezed her heart. In their eyes, she was only a deception, and no one was ready to believe in her true essence. The knights pushed the girl straight into the pit with snakes, and she began to fall down, feeling the ground slipping out from under her feet. At that moment, her body suddenly turned over, and she felt herself being pulled heavily downwards, straight into that terrible dark space of snakes, whose eyes glowed with an ominous red light. She realized one terrible thing. She was actually reincarnated. All her doubts and insecurities about her own essence disappeared at that moment. She really belonged to those who had transferred their soul from another world. The girl woke up scared in a wet sweat. Her breathing was intermittent, her heart was pounding in her chest. She looked around, trying to figure out where she was, and realized that it had all been a nightmare. However, the fear and tension did not leave her, and the thought that she now knew what her true nature was did not give her peace. The girl did not understand whether she had dreamed of her own death. The feeling of the reality of that nightmare was too vivid, and the fear did not leave her. The girl tried to calm herself down, taking deep breaths, trying to get her thoughts in order. She closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing, to get rid of the remnants of fear that had taken hold of her. The dream was too realistic. The malice of people, the distrustful looks, everything seemed so real. These events could easily happen in her life, and it made her heart clench with fear. People were constantly whispering that she had been reborn or was lying. These conversations were everywhere. In the corridors, on the streets, behind her back. Every step she took, every word she said was questioned. This did not give her peace, because even if she knew the truth, no one wanted to believe her. But if we accept that the memories of the past life were also just dreams, where did these feelings of genuine sadness and regret come from? These emotions could not have been simply imaginary. They were real. The grandmother she saw in her memories and her last words stayed with her. How she swore to fulfill her will. How she assured her that she would follow this path, despite everything that awaited her. The girl realized that it couldn't have been just a dream. All these memories, feelings, and especially her grandmother's words, they were real, not fictitious. She remembered everything too clearly. Every detail, every word, every look, everything was so vivid that there was no doubt that it was not just fantasy or fiction. This was very confusing for the girl because it was all very strange. Could this really be her past life and the moment that had already happened with the girl? She was always the butt of jokes within the estate. People laughed at her origins, at the fact that she was an outsider, different from everyone else. Even the maid mocked and humiliated her, all because she used abilities similar to the power of incarnation. These abilities, which she tried to hide, only attracted attention and condemnation. The maid envied her because she did less work, but she was more appreciated in the palace. Every time the girl used her abilities, people began to pay attention to her, and she was granted recognition. There were many people standing in the garden, and they were all watching with interest the red-haired girl standing in the center. From her outstretched hand, a huge train came out, which flew through the air with ease as if it were something natural. People were in anticipation, expecting her to demonstrate something else amazing, because the ability to create such large objects from nothing was perceived as something incredible. This was to be expected from this lady, because when she reached the second stage, they would not only be able to observe her powers, but they would also be able to actually ride this train. There was something mesmerizing about her abilities, and everyone knew it was just the beginning. But it also looked magical and amazing. The guy turned to the girl and told her to show something too, because their stages were the same. He waited with interest for what she would demonstrate, knowing that her abilities were not limited to the little. The girl agreed, slightly nervous, and said she would try. She held out her hand, concentrating all her attention, trying to remember how to use her powers. The girl also tried to radiate a train in her hands. She concentrated all her strength, imagining a huge structure that could amaze those around her. With every effort, with every breath, she tried to call that very train. When she succeeded, she asked the guy if he liked it. She waited impatiently for his answer, hoping that she had lived up to his expectations at least a little. The red-haired girl was watching all this, her gaze attentive and appraising. The red-haired girl came closer to the girl and with a mocking smile asked what kind of small piece of iron she had in her hands, and whether she really envied her beautiful incarnations. Her voice sounded quite arrogant. The girl didn't know what to answer the red-haired one. She stood there, looking at her in confusion, not knowing how to react to her mockery. Her abilities weren't as developed as this girl's yet, and she didn't want to show weakness. The man looked angrily at the girl and, not hiding his irritation, ordered her to apologize to the red-haired girl. His gaze was hard, as if he expected her to obey, not allowing her to even think about resistance. The girl was frightened by everything that was happening. Her heart was pounding wildly and her thoughts were confused. She could not understand why she was being forced to apologize, although she had done nothing wrong. That's exactly how it all happened. The girl felt her desire to retain some dignity fading and decided that she would no longer use her power. The girl sat by the lake and washed the dishes, absorbed in the quiet sounds of the water and the rustling of the leaves. She couldn't understand when it had happened, when her life had changed so much. Everything that was happening seemed alien and distant, as if she were already in another world. The girl was thinking about washing the dishes, and the brunette was standing behind her and watching her. She had already gotten up from the ground and was about to leave when she suddenly saw the guy. The guy smiled sincerely and said that he was looking for her. He was dressed in a beautiful suit with decorations. The girl, looking at the river, asked what brought him here. The guy answered with displeasure that it was a very cold reaction, and he just wanted to see her. The girl thought that he was laughing at her, too. She didn't really like the guy's presence. The girl turned to face him and still asked why he wanted to see her. Rosetta's words sounded rather rude. He excitedly asked her again because she should have known that he was interested in absolutely all the people in the mansion. The girl thought about the fact that she was remembering a similar conversation. Suddenly, the guy continued his question. He asked the girl if she had heard that Karina had shown the power of incarnation again. She thought that the guy had already spoken about it once. The girl replied that the red-haired one's affairs were none of her business. She didn't understand why everything was so strange, especially this conversation. Rosetta definitely remembers it. It happened before. The guy asked the girl if she had a similar power, although he had known the answer for a long time. She answered calmly and said that the power was not worth her attention, if compared to the abilities of the red-haired one. And she would continue to wash the dishes because these were duties. The guy didn't understand what was wrong with the girl because she changed her attitude towards him too quickly. This puzzled and upset him. The girl walked away from the river, her steps becoming faster and faster, as if she was trying to escape from the accumulated emotions. The guy, persistently following her, did not lag behind even a step, as if he hoped that she would stop and listen to him. The girl angrily asked what he was even talking about, displeasure sounding in her voice. In response, the guy calmly noted that if she envied the red-haired one's abilities, then she shouldn't, because she also had the power of embodiment. However, he added, she needed to learn to demonstrate this power so that others could see and appreciate it. He placed his hand on the girl's shoulder, gently but insistently, causing her to freeze in place. The boy, feeling her body tense, said quietly but confidently that despite the people's laughter and ridicule, he believed that she could become even stronger than the red-haired one if only she believed in herself. He couldn't understand the girl's strange mood. Her behavior was quite rude. This made the guy angry for a couple of minutes. The guy smiled and, looking into her eyes, told her to always turn to him if she had any difficulties, and he would always be on her side. The girl hesitated a little, processing his words, and suddenly realized that he was behaving exactly the same as in the dream, as if that image was not accidental. She removed his hand from her shoulder, feeling her irritation growing, and thanked the guy in a restrained but still tense voice. She also added with a hint of irritation that she was busy with her duties as a maid and had neither the time nor the inclination to think about the affairs of the nobility. After these words, she quickly turned around and left, leaving the guy alone with his thoughts and an incomprehensible look that she did not want to meet. It was hard to believe, but the girl felt like she had returned to the past. Everything around her seemed familiar, but just in case, she needed to make sure that this was not just a game of her mind, but reality. She placed the bucket of dishes and water on the table, trying to concentrate and sort out her feelings, still doubting what had happened. She sighed, wiping the sweat from her forehead from the weight of the bucket and the thoughts that were bothering her. It all seemed too incredible to be true, but she couldn't find an explanation for this strange feeling. Suddenly, a red-haired girl bursts into the kitchen, her face glowing with excitement. She shouts joyfully and asks if she heard what happened, not hiding her enthusiasm. The girl, a little irritated, answered with rumors and asked about the incarnation of the red-haired one. The red-haired one immediately became wary and, with surprise in her voice, asked how she knew about it. The redhead asked with a sly smile if the girl wanted to lose to her, and added that she needed to try to show her strength. Everything around seemed so familiar that the girl could hardly believe what was happening, but the girl knew that she could no longer be fooled like that. She was no longer the type to give in to these games and manipulations. The girl turned to her friend and, looking into her eyes, asked with a cold gaze how much she had been paid this time, and what the price of her humiliation was. But the redhead just asked in fear what she was talking about. Her eyes widened noticeably, as if she didn't understand what she was talking about. The girl added to her friend with slight disdain that Lady Delan had told her to provoke her, so that the red-haired one would look better in the background. In the end, she asked with a grin, "Did you guess?" But the redhead immediately ran up to her, screaming in panic that she shouldn't say something stupid. She quickly stated that it was just a misunderstanding and that she had no reason to do something like that. But the girl quietly called her friend and, feeling her hand on her shoulder, tried to remove it, not wanting her to continue to press on her. The girl began to walk away from her friend sullenly, feeling her irritation growing. She didn't want to listen to any more excuses that weren't believed in her. She added that she would take care of her duties and was not interested in incarnations or other nonsense. If her friend needed recognition, let her earn it with a normal job, not games and manipulations. The girl closed the door and leaned against it, feeling a heaviness in her soul. It was now obvious that she had returned to the past, and this thought did not give her peace. But she was sure that this time the terrible fate would not be repeated. She was ready to change everything she could to avoid what had happened before. The Tower Mansion looked quite calm at night. Its silhouette, illuminated by dim light, gave the impression of neither excessive luxury nor poverty. It was somewhere in between, as if hiding its true essence. The girl was sleeping in a small, gloomy room on an old bed, her body tense even in her sleep. On another, a little further away, lay a red-haired girl quietly snoring, carefree and peaceful, as if everything around was in order. The girl sat up tensely in bed, feeling her thoughts begin to spin again. The room was quiet, but her inner unrest did not leave her for a second. The girl looked out the window at the night sky, and feeling the cold wind, she thought that it was at night that everything happened. She was sure that this moment had become a turning point, and now she would have to face something she could barely understand. The very incident she had tried to forget now stood before her, clear and distinct as never before. Everything that had happened since then seemed to be only the aftermath of what had happened that very night. The dense and dark forest was illuminated only by the moon, its dim light breaking through the trees, creating bizarre shadows on the ground. In this night twilight, everything around seemed mysterious and enigmatic, as if the forest was hiding ancient secrets. The girl wandered in the middle of the forest with a flashlight, its dim light barely cutting through the darkness, making her steps uncertain. The forest seemed boundless, and every rustle around made her heart beat faster. She looked around carefully, her gaze sliding over the trees and bushes, expecting to see at least something that would resemble the place where the Duke's body was found. And if she didn't want to die, she had to help him. This thought flashed through her head, and she felt that not only her own life, but also the fate of the one who was connected to this mysterious place depended on her actions. Suddenly, she heard a sound and turned sharply in his direction, her heart beating faster. Something moved in the darkness of the forest, and her gaze tried to catch at least some details. She froze in surprise when she saw a guy, a blonde, wounded, and leaning against a tree. His face was pale. Her eyes widened in horror and her mouth fell open, unable to utter a word when she saw this horrible picture. The wounded boy was breathing with difficulty, and everything around him seemed unreal in this instant silence of the forest. It was the Duke, who was in pain, his face twisted in fear and pain. She couldn't believe her eyes. The one who seemed unattainable and majestic now lay at her feet, helpless and vulnerable. He made a small sound, and the girl, barely containing her emotions, thanked God that he was still alive. Her heart beat faster, but deep down she knew that this was only the beginning. The girl looked at his leg and saw a deep gash from which blood continued to flow. Her heart sank. The wound was too serious, and she knew that if he did not receive immediate help, he would most likely not survive before he could be dragged to safety. The girl, wasting no time, began to tear the hem of her dress, trying to make a bandage out of the fabric. Her hands were shaking, but she couldn't afford to panic. Time was running out, and every second was worth its weight in gold. She quickly bandaged the wound on his leg, trying to pull the cloth as tight as possible to stop the bleeding. Her hands were wet with sweat, but she did not stop, knowing that his life depended on her actions. She tried desperately to figure out what to do, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. Every attempt to tighten the bandage was futile, and she felt fear creeping up on her. The girl panicked and thought about what she needed to do to stop the bleeding. After a few short thoughts, she finally remembered how to stop the bleeding. The girl, realizing that there was almost no time left, decided that she needed to try magic. She concentrated, accumulating her energy. In order for her magic to be strong enough, she needed a second stage of manifestation. She concentrated, trying to gather all the strength she could and force her magic to awaken to a new level. She still managed to create a blue turnstile. Its light was visible. It was like magic. The girl was surprised by what she had done. She had not expected her magic to be so effective, especially in such a critical situation. She was glad she had managed to summon the tourniquet. A sense of satisfaction at having managed such a difficult spell filled her, although she was still nervous about the Duke's condition. She began to use the tourniquet carefully on the Duke, wrapping it around the wound and slowly tightening it to seal the result. Each movement was careful and focused. The girl breathed a sigh of relief when she saw that the blood was no longer flowing. The tourniquet had worked, and although the wound was still painful, she knew that he now had a chance to survive. There was no longer a threat to life, and the girl breathed a sigh of relief. But now she faced a new question. What to do next? She decided that the Duke needed to be taken to the temple and healed. It was the only place where he could be guaranteed safety and professional help. She knew she couldn't do it alone. The journey was too long and difficult, and the bleeding could start again. She needed to find someone who could help. Suddenly, she heard a painful sound from the Duke, weak but full of despair. His body twitched slightly and his face distorted with pain. The girl quickly approached him. He opened his mouth and black smoke began to come out, wrapping itself around his body like an ominous shadow. The girl froze, unable to understand what was happening, but a feeling of fear gripped her. This was not the usual symptom of a wound. Thoughts were racing through her head. Something abnormal was happening to the Duke. She tried to grab the smoke with her hand, hoping to understand what this strange phenomenon was. As soon as her fingers touched the black smoke, she was hit by a strong electric shock. She pulled her hand back, feeling pain as if a cold energy had penetrated her. He was gone. The black smoke disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, and the Duke himself was no longer where he had been just moments before. The girl could not believe her eyes. His body had disappeared, leaving her alone in the dark forest, overcome with fear and bewilderment. Suddenly, the Duke opened his eyes. His gaze was strangely empty, and there was no previous rage or pain in it. He stared into space in front of him, as if he did not notice her, but suddenly he noticed the girl. His eyes focused on her, and there was an expression on his face that she couldn't immediately understand. He seemed to be trying to remember what had happened, but there was still a shadow in his gaze, as if he wasn't quite himself. The girl immediately turned to him, not knowing what to say. She stood there at a loss, trying to understand what was happening and how to help the Duke, who looked like he had lost touch with reality. But she still asked about the Duke's well-being, trying to pull him out of this strange state. The anxiety in her voice was obvious, and she hoped that at least his words would help her understand what had happened to him. Suddenly, she heard shouts, where people were calling for the boy. The voices grew louder, and she realized that they were getting closer. But her anxiety did not go away. What if they, too, could not understand what had happened to the Duke? People started running up to them. Their eyes showed concern and anxiety, but they still strove towards the Duke as if trying to bring him back to reality. One man looked at the girl angrily, as if blaming her for what had happened to the Duke. His gaze was full of displeasure and contempt, and she felt a sense of guilt wash over her, although she did not understand what exactly had caused such a reaction. He accused her of killing the Duke, his voice full of rage. The other people around her began to look at her with suspicion, and she felt her heart squeeze. But she denied the accusation, confidently stating that on the contrary, she had helped the Duke. Her voice trembled with anger and fear. She tried to explain. He asked angrily why he should believe her, his eyes flashing with rage and the atmosphere around him becoming more and more tense. But the girl took the Duke's hand and said that he was still alive. Her voice was firm despite the growing tension. She was trying to prove that his life had been saved, and all she had done was try to help him, but he couldn't believe it, because there was a pool of blood around. His gaze slid along the ground, and doubt began to take hold of him more and more. She replied that she had provided first aid, and tried to explain that her actions were aimed at saving the Duke. But the man continued to threaten her, his words becoming even more cruel. But the girl understood that his words were not true. She knew that she was saving the Duke, and all her actions were aimed only at his well-being. But if Dylan found out that the girl had moved on to the second stage, she would not leave it alone. It could cause even more problems because she was always cruel in her methods. But suddenly the Duke broke the silence and made a sound of pain, which made everyone freeze. The man was surprised that the Duke was actually alive. His expression changed, and the doubt in his eyes gradually gave way to bewilderment. The boy turned to him and said that he needed help. His voice was tense, but there was an urgent request in it. The man turned and ordered his assistant to take the Duke away. His commanding tone was firm. The house looked beautiful in the rays of the sun. The light fell softly on its walls, giving them a golden hue. The wind gently swayed the leaves of the trees around, creating an atmosphere of peace and tranquility that contrasted with the events taking place inside. The Duke lay on a large bed, his body covered with a warm blanket. Next to him stood a man in white clothes, most likely a doctor or healer who was intently examining his wounds. He came back to the man, and there was a tourniquet on his arm, tightly tightened to stop the bleeding. The man in white clothes looked at him carefully. The man took it in his palm and looked at it with surprise. His gaze was full of bewilderment, as if he was trying to understand how this was possible. The girl was kneeling in front of a man in the middle of a large room, and he was conducting some interrogation with her. The atmosphere was tense. He asked if she had tried to kill the Duke. His voice was hard and his eyes were full of suspicion. The girl felt her heart beat faster, trying to find the right words to justify herself. She did not expect to find herself in such a situation and was ready to defend her truth despite all the accusations. But the man, in response to her excuses, asked why there was a suspicious object on his body, showing a tourniquet. His fingers pointed to a blue tourniquet that was tightly tied to his arm. The doubt in his eyes was obvious, and now the girl felt that every movement she made under the man's gaze could be interpreted as yet another accusation. But the girl knew that without him, the Duke would have died. She met his gaze, trying to remain calm. The man was shouting that he would make her confess. His voice was menacing and his eyes were blazing with determination. He was ready to go all the way to get a confession, and the girl felt the pressure increase with every word. Suddenly, a woman appeared and said that this pathetic creature would not speak until the very end. Her voice was cold and confident. The man turned to her in surprise, but she didn't let him interfere, looking at the girl with obvious contempt. She added, walking up the stairs, that they should not engage in useless activities. Her steps were confident, and she did not pay attention to the objections. The woman was clearly determined to do things her way, and her words sounded like a sentence. The woman said she had brought a witness. Her words sounded so confident that everyone in the room froze. All eyes turned to her, waiting to see who this witness was and how his testimony could affect the outcome of the interrogation. She turned to the man and said he could leave the matter to her. Her voice was calm, but there was authority in it, as if she had already made up her mind. The girl thought that the woman had intervened as if she knew all the details of what was happening, and the Duke and the priest had appeared too timely. The woman called out to someone, and her voice sounded authoritative. A few moments later, a man walked through the door, his steps confident and determined. But suddenly you could see a red-haired, tearful girl named Ella. Her eyes were red from tears, and her face expressed helplessness and confusion. The girl was surprised by this turn of events. She froze and stopped breathing in anticipation. The redhead came closer to the girl and said that she suddenly left the room at dawn, and she heard her friend wanting to go and curse the Duke. The girl wiped away her tears and finally added that she was very scared, although she really looked helpless. The girl was upset because so much effort was spent on saving the Duke. Soon, everything returned to how it was before the incident. The woman sat down next to her and said that lying would not give anything and demanded the truth. It looked disgusting on her part. The girl did not quite understand what truth she was talking about. She was angry at everything that was happening. The girl said that when she left the room, Ella was sleeping and snoring very loudly and could not hear anything at all. The other maids laughed because it was true and noticed that it was very difficult to fall asleep in the room with her. The girl watched them in confusion, but the girl realized that her reputation was being damaged and shouted that Rosetta wanted to harm His Majesty. But Rosetta angrily replied that he himself could tell what had been happening to him all this time and whether someone wanted to kill him. She already said seriously that only then would they find out who wanted to kill the Duke in truth. The woman's smile distorted. This was not quite what she expected. The maid was mad as hell, ready to destroy everything in her path. The woman began to approach the tied-up girl, saying that he had not yet recovered. She grabbed her by the hair and ordered her to stop lying and making up various untrue stories, and of course to admit her guilt. She screamed and asked how a pathetic maid could disturb the Duke. and also that the girl should be flogged right there, when suddenly a soft voice appeared, saying that it was not worth hitting his savior. The woman, shocked, moved away from the girl. The girl opened one eye to see who said it. Interest got the better of her. Suddenly, she saw the Duke on the stairs, and next to him, a red-haired girl who was trying to attract attention. This man was the same Duke she had saved. He had ash-white hair and soft gray eyes. The man and woman who were bullying the girl greeted him as soon as they saw him. The man asked the Duke in confusion if he was feeling better. He couldn't quite imagine a way out of the situation. But the red-haired one took him by the arm with a smile and told him not to worry because she took care of him with her power. The man said anxiously that the Duke should rest longer. He clearly hadn't expected the boy to come at this particular time. The boy gently pulled the girl's hand away from his own and calmly said that he was okay. Red Hair, who was standing nearby, was surprised by such a gesture, clearly not expecting him to react like that. The guy slowly approached the girl, who was sitting on her knees with her hands tied. She did not know what to expect from the Duke. The guy knelt down and slowly extended his hand to the girl. It was a rather strange sign on his part. The Duke smiled tenderly and quietly asked the girl if everything was okay with her. She was surprised by such a sign from the guy. The Duke is dressed in a formal dark blue suit with a luxurious gold ornament on the tuxedo. Around his neck hangs a pendant with a large blue stone in the center. He smiles and raises his hand forward as if he is offering something. The girl was very surprised by such attention from the guy, as she did not expect such a gesture from him. The guy stared at the girl with his gray eyes, which were full of concentration, as if he was trying to understand her every thought. His attention was drawn to the rope around the girl's waist. It was tied tightly, as if it was hiding something important. The guy leaned towards the girl, deciding to break the rope that was tightly restraining her movements. He pulled the end, but suddenly a low voice, full of anxiety, was heard, which discreetly but insistently asked him not to do this. Suddenly, a stern man with a worried expression on his face asked if the Duke was okay, if he understood what was happening. His voice was firm and confident, as if he was not just asking a question, but demanding an answer. The man came closer, took out a tourniquet, and, showing it, said that they were conducting an interrogation and that she did not need to untie the rope. His words were direct and convincing. The Duke, looking calmly at the turnstile, said that there was nothing magical or amazing about this object. The man, hearing such words, was surprised, not expecting such a calm and confident answer. The man insistently argued that the girl had tried to cast a curse and that the object was completely unknown. The Duke, without showing any particular excitement, simply asked if the man had never heard of it. He was too calm. The man asked what exactly they were talking about. But the Duke, lost in thought, remembered an ancient legend known to all the inhabitants of the city. He added that those who are able to summon strange and unknown objects are called reincarnated. The man, filled with anger and panic, also did not understand what the Duke was talking about. His facial expression reflected complete bewilderment and confusion. But the guy smiled and, with a slight assurance in his voice, said that she was the savior who embodied this object and helped him in a difficult moment. He also said, pointing at her, that she was a true reincarnated being with incredible strength and abilities that no one expected. The other maids were shocked by this news and began to whisper among themselves, unable to believe what they were hearing. The Duke extended his hand to the girl, and she accepted his gesture. But around him there were quiet voices of people who could not believe what was happening. But suddenly the head maid screamed, claiming that the girl was a fake and that she was lying because she did not remember her past life. The Duke, having listened to her attentively, asked if her words had really played a role in the appearance of this object. However, the woman did not calm down and continued to insist that the girl was trying to harm him. The girl was already standing on her feet and, with confidence in her voice, said that there was no magic in this object and that it was just a turnstile. She held tightly to the Duke's hand, as if wanting to emphasize her confidence and support. The girl decided that she needed to calm down. She realized that she had a chance to survive, and she could not afford to lose her composure at such a moment. The man, with anger on his face, handed the object to the girl and ordered her to explain how it worked, demanding an immediate answer. The girl slowly took the turnstile in her hands, feeling its weight and preparing to explain how it worked. The girl explained that the tourniquet is designed to stop bleeding. If you clamp it above the wound, the blood will stop flowing, and this will help prevent further blood loss. But the red-haired woman, with fury in her voice, shouted at the Duke that she was lying, trying to confuse everyone with her words. The girl also added that she used the tourniquet in her past life to save people's lives, and that it was one of her most important and necessary items. The red-haired girl was overcome with rage, her fists clenched in anger, and she barely held back the urge to vent her anger. The Duke decided to break the silence and, looking at those present, said that all misunderstandings had already been resolved, and there was no longer any reason for concern. The Duke covered the girl with his hand and told the man to stop talking, because he had seen the real criminal with his own eyes. The man was immediately interested in who it was, but the Duke calmly said that they had a completely different matter to resolve first. The atmosphere grew heavier. The Duke said that they should punish the maid who gave false testimony. The redhead was not only scared, but also surprised by this turn of events. The red-haired girl wanted to run away to avoid punishment, but suddenly she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned around and saw the head maid who had forced her to give false testimony to the Duke. The girl did not understand why the woman grabbed and stopped her. She looked up at the woman again, not knowing what to expect next. The redhead was very scared, and there were small beads of sweat on her face. The redhead immediately found herself on her knees in front of the Duke's savior. It was humiliating for her. She could only wait to see what would happen next. The redhead grabbed the girl by the dress and asked with tears in her eyes if she would betray her friend. She tried to save her life somehow. The man watched what was happening and thought that the girl had a rather soft heart and would quickly forgive and forget everything. But he still told the savior to decide what the punishment would be. The maids gossiped among themselves that she was the one who was told to choose the punishment and that she would forgive the girl. But suddenly the girl opened her mouth and finally dropped a couple of words. Absolutely, everyone was waiting for this moment. But the girl said she wanted the redhead to receive the punishment of an ordinary worker who accepted others. But the usual punishment in such cases is to put on a sign that says, "Liar," then walk around the mansion, after which she will be chased away. Rumors spread quickly, so finding a new job will be really difficult. The girl looked at the maid who was in tears and tried to convince her that it was definitely not her fault and that she herself was trying to get rid of the Duke's savior. The mansion was beautiful. A large fence around the house, many rooms and floors. It was made in light and cozy colors. The Duke was sleeping peacefully on his luxurious bed, which was made to match the style of the room in blue tones. Near the bed, on a chair, sat a girl who was worried about him. The girl was tormented by thoughts about whether she could stay close to the Duke, because the red-haired Karina would have coped much better than she could. But she was still grateful to the Duke. It can be considered that he gave her a chance for a new life and even made her famous. He let her choose the punishment for the maid. She gently and carefully covered the Duke. He slept peacefully and soundly. The guy looked cute. His hair fell carelessly over his face. But suddenly a red-haired girl flew into the room and told Rosetta to go out. She looked too happy. Red Hair entered the room and said that she would now take care of the Duke. Her voice sounded too confident. The girl stood up from her chair and calmly agreed. Red-haired mockingly reminded him of the Duke's rescue and added that it was not she who helped him, but just an illusion. Karina said angrily that her stupid magic was not capable of such a thing and that he felt better after leaving. It sounded rude and cruel from the girl, but the girl just decided to keep quiet and forget her words, so she said she would go. She didn't look very sad, but she wasn't happy either. The girl silently went to the exit, and the red-haired girl came closer to the bed where the Duke lay. Silence reigned in the room, but suddenly the girl heard the Duke's voice asking her to wait. She looked at him with her blue eyes. It was quite a strange behavior of the guy. The girl froze, waiting for the guy's words. She did not quite understand what was going to happen now. Her long white hair was tied with a bow, which added to her cuteness. The Duke sat down on the bed and with a sad expression on his face asked his savior to stay next to him. He looked truly unhappy. The girl's eyes widened at the Duke's behavior. It was too unexpected for her. She silently looked at the guy, not knowing what to do. The girl asked confusedly if he wanted to stay with her and not with the red-haired one. It looked strange on his part. Why did he choose her? Red-haired began to leave, but still turned around and looked angrily after the girl. She wanted to get the Duke's heart, but there was one small obstacle. The girl, sad and confused, watched everything that was happening. She pressed her hands to her chest. Her blue eyes were too strange. There were incomprehensible feelings in them. Red Hair had already approached the door and wanted to open it, but suddenly she heard someone calling her and she turned to the source of the sound. It was the Duke. She immediately ran to the Duke's bed and asked him with a smile if he needed anything. She also said that she would do everything, but he calmly and coldly replied that she needed to go out, apologizing before doing so. It was quite rude of him. The red-haired girl named Karina clearly did not expect such a turn of events and rudeness from the Duke. Her face was not only surprised, but also frightened. The Duke added that this conversation would concern the person who saved her, but not for her, that is, the red-haired one. The girls froze in anticipation. No one knew what to do. But Karina did not back down and, having calmed down, said that the Duke had clearly made a mistake in something. Finally, she added that it was she who had saved him. Her words sounded very convincing, but the guy decided to ask an obvious question, the answer to which only the real savior knew. How can you save a person from death with that strange object? But then he heard only silence. Now he said calmly that he was not mistaken for sure, because he saw how Miss Rosetta stopped the bleeding on his leg. He was sure of his words. The girl said, confused, that she just needed the Duke to understand that she cared about him. She said this with some sadness. The girl stood far from them and heard everything. She thought that when the red-haired one spoke like that, everyone believed her words. The thought came to her that the Duke had always believed her words, too. It made her sad, because it was so unfair. But the Duke still distracted the red-haired one from her speech and said that he and Miss Rosetta absolutely needed to talk, and that she should leave them as quickly as possible. He began to ask the girl about this, and the savior stood behind, confused. She was surprised by this and also by the Duke's rudeness. Red-haired continued to stand and look angrily at the Duke. She did not understand why the Duke needed to stay in the room with this maid. Red Hair angrily headed for the door and said at the end that she would be back soon. The girl's steps were fast, but very loud. One could understand her displeasure. The girl who remained in the room quietly watched the guy who slowly got out of bed. She waited for his words. He came closer to her and called her, holding out his hand to the confused girl. She, not knowing what to do, continued to stand in place. She gently placed her hand in his. It was quite a sweet and romantic gesture. There was silence between them. He slowly sat down on his knees in front of the girl and leaned his face closer to her hand, but the guy kissed her tenderly. This created a wonderful atmosphere in the room. There was some romance between them. He slowly raised his head and, smiling, thanked the girl for saving him. The Duke looked sincere. His face was joyful. The girl looked at the Duke with loving eyes. She admired the fact that the guy believed her. This made her very happy. She said sheepishly that anyone would have done the same in her place. The girl was glad of the guy's confessions because she had done everything for a reason. The man started to rise to his feet and said, looking into her eyes, that he would not have been saved the way she did. The girl did not quite understand his words, so she asked again. The man stood up in front of her and asked if she had helped him with her ability, although he was sure that she had. The girl silently looked into his eyes. He added that if she was the reincarnated one from the prophecy, she would be able to deal with the curse of the evil spirit inside him. The girl asked in surprise if he really thought she was capable of such a thing. She was pleased to hear that, but his behavior was strange, and what kind of spirit was he anyway? The Duke confirmed her words with a smile and said that it did not matter at all what others would say, because his life was saved and this was an indisputable fact. The guy let go of the girl's hand, and she thought that maybe he only believed that she was reincarnated. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't amazing either. That's why he treats the girl so well. She felt very sad at this thought. She hoped that his kindness was just like that. The girl was overcome with sadness, because if she had not been reborn, the Duke would not have even been interested in her person. The Duke noticed that the girl had become gloomy and reported this, asking if he had made any mistake. After all, the girl's face really did not look happy. The girl immediately rejected his words and said that it was simply the first time she had been thanked for something like that. It was enough for her that the Duke was fine, because such useless thoughts would not give anything. The girl decided to ask the guy about the curse of the evil spirit. He asked if she remembered the black smoke that came out of his mouth. His voice was calm. The girl remembered how she tried to catch him with her hand and confirmed his words and asked if he was about him. She was surprised. The Duke said that it was this smoke, because it was the curse of an evil spirit that was taking his life. This information was quite strange and creepy for the girl. The girl thought and was surprised because she only had the power of embodiment and she could not destroy this spirit. There were a lot of thoughts about it in her head. She clasped her hands in anxiety and tried to figure out how she could eradicate the Duke's curse. It seemed impossible. The girl was surprised. Did the reincarnated really have other abilities because no one had ever spoken about it? Maybe this was a great secret? The boy interrupted her thoughts and asked if she knew why he had come to the Duke of Humphrey's domain. He froze, waiting for an answer. The girl replied that she didn't know. Her face reflected anxiety that was hard to miss. A small drop of sweat from fatigue was visible on her forehead. The guy looked at her calmly and slowly began his speech. It felt like he was in no hurry to tell the girl anything, but he continued and said that he was looking for the lost daughter of His Majesty. It sounded stern and loud. The guy went quiet after that. The girl was very surprised by such news. Her eyes became much wider from the information she had just received. She was silent and tried to understand the whole meaning of the Duke's words. On a dark night, the light was on in the mansion on the highest tower when everyone around was already asleep. It looked mysterious and enigmatic. A gloomy man sat at his desk in his office. He had gloves on his hands, which made him look stern. He was clearly unhappy about something, asking if someone was serious. The Duke stood before his desk and confirmed his words, saying that he had come here on a secret visit on behalf of His Majesty to find the lost princess. His voice was serious and cold. He looked at the man carefully and asked if he believed him. His gaze was penetrating, which was very difficult to resist. His voice was confident and cold, but he replied that he was simply surprised. But the guy knew the truth, because this Duke had earned the Emperor's trust. And the man's behavior was quite strange. There were strange thoughts inside the man because he could not even imagine that such a young Duke would be given such an important task. He was very angry. The man asked if he was sure that the long-lost daughter of the Emperor was still alive, since there had once been rumors that she had died and no trace had appeared for 16 years. But the boy rejected his words because 16 years ago only the deceased Empress Beatrice was found, but the fate of her daughter still remained a mystery. His face did not stop frowning. Exactly 16 years ago, there was a long-standing prophecy in the Stan Empire about the last reincarnated one. It was on everyone's lips back then. It said that the object of the prophecy was a girl in the Empress's womb. She was to lead the empire to prosperity. But shortly before the official announcement of the prophecy, the Empress suddenly disappeared and left a letter of apology to the Emperor. The Emperor could not come to terms with her departure and desperately searched for her, not giving up his eternal hope. After some searching, he decided to keep the prophecy a secret. He still hoped that he would find his beloved. A few months later, something unusual happened. All this time, the Emperor was diligently searching for his wife. Communication with the owner of the lands of Count Norton began, but something terrible was discovered there that the girl did not expect. The girl's body was lying on the floor, and it was no longer alive. The lifeless body of the Empress was on the cold parquet. It could be noticed that the remaining body of the Empress and the princesses had disappeared. The Duke thought that since then he had not even stopped searching, but in 16 years, the guy still had not managed to find her trail. The man angrily asked the young Duke how he was going to find the princess who had disappeared more than 10 years ago. The Duke confirmed his words, but suddenly the voice of a man standing near the door was heard. He said that he had never heard of such a girl living in this estate. The Duke calmly replied that there had been rumors that a reincarnated woman had appeared here. He added that at first he had not believed it either, but then something else had made him change his mind. A certain prophecy came from the Azra Temple. It sounded like this: the reincarnated one, who hides from the eyes of the owner in the Western lands. The Duke added that the Western lands were theirs, to which the man panicked and tried to improve the situation by saying that this prophecy must be true, although they knew nothing about it. Finally, he folded his arms and looked at the girl. He looked scared. His eyes looked at the Duke without stopping, but the Duke watched this calmly. He waited for further actions and, so to speak, their instructions. The guy was sure that the girl was on their lands. The man stood up from his chair and told the Duke that he had come here secretly, only to take all the credit for the girl's finds for himself. But he replied that it was merely a task from the Emperor. The guy paused for a moment and confidently said that he had seen Miss Rosetta use the power of embodiment. The man, worried and frightened, explained to the boy again. There was a feeling that he was stubbornly hiding something. The man said that what she was doing was a crude illusion technique, and if a child with the power of embodiment had been discovered here, he would have been the first to report it. The Duke rejected his words and said that he saw everything clearly. Suddenly, the second man said that this was not an incarnation at all, because he had lived in these lands for a very long time and therefore understood very well. The guy was silent. He created a silence in which the men began to worry, each for his own. It was strange, But the Duke smiled and said that in that case, he would take her to the capital to check with the priest, because that would definitely clarify the situation. The man was silent and did not understand what to do, but still agreed with the young Duke's idea. Another man turned to him in fear, but the second added that it was necessary to suggest that this was the reincarnated daughter of the emperor. But the man added with a smile that if the Duke was wrong, he would bear full responsibility. He looked truly frightening, but this did not frighten him at all. He agreed with a smile and was already waiting for the moment when they could go to the capital and said that he would go. As soon as the Duke left the office, the man hit him with his fist and a loud sound was heard. The man standing behind him reminded him in fear that he had said that after the prophecy's trick, getting rid of the Duke would be even easier. He silenced him. The man manipulated the prophecy very well to lure him into his territory and kill him. Rosetta, the blonde young girl who ruined all the man's plans when she saved the Duke. The man again turned to his superiors and said that as far as he knew, the girl had moved on to the second stage, and her existence would clearly interfere with Lady Karina. But it was clear that the Duke had already cast a protective spell on the girl, and now it would be much more difficult to kill her. The man tried to calm his assistant down, but he wouldn't calm down. This made him even more angry. He shouted angrily and asked how he dared to say such a thing. The man was furious. The man ordered his assistant to watch his tongue. He also added that they would not live if the plan was revealed. Also, the Duke has already seen him, and they need to be much more careful. To implement their plan, they need to report too much patience. The assistant also added that the girl's ability to incarnate is amazing, and even the Duke is alive after his attack. The man tried to close his mouth. He replied that they would find a random person and prove to the Duke that he was wrong. The assistant confirmed and approved the plan. The man thought it didn't seem like the girl knew about the curse, so they still had a small advantage to win. He angrily noted that they needed to deal with the girl as quickly as possible, because it would help convince the Duke as well. The mansion was quiet and calm, although life was seething inside. It was a clear and sunny day outside. The many trees became even greener because of this. The girl washed dishes in a bucket and thought that she had helped the Duke and moved on to the second stage. But everyday life had not changed at all. She was sad that they were talking badly to her and shouting at her, but she was glad that no one died. The girl continued to do her own thing, but she knew she couldn't let her guard down because now the head maid would be even more persistent and she'd better run away before something happened. She was sure that the Empire needed only one reincarnation, namely the red-haired Karina. This girl wanted to be special, to have all the attention on her. The girl wondered if anyone would mind if she disappeared. These thoughts tormented her, not understanding what to do. She wondered if she could settle in the mountains or near the ocean and live a quiet and happy life. It was unpleasant for her to realize what she was thinking about, but there was no other way out. The girl wanted to live in peace, but it seems to the girl that the Duke has not yet realized that the red-haired girl is also reincarnated. After all, this could completely change the whole situation. They probably wouldn't see each other again, but this Duke was the first person to believe her words. And she was incredibly pleased with this thought. The girl closed her eyes and continued to think. Her heart was too weak, and she had already begun to doubt his kindness and attitude towards her. The girl thought that with such a character, it would clearly be difficult for her to survive. But after escaping, she would immediately eat delicious food. The girl remembered different names of food, but she felt sad that not all dishes exist in this world. The girl continued doing her business when she suddenly heard a sound and slowly began to look for the source of the sound with her eyes. She was scared by this. In front of her were the maids, who stood and looked at her angrily. The girl froze when she saw them. In front of her, she saw the evil head maid, with two more young maids standing next to her. The girl did not understand why she had come here and what she wanted to do. The girl saw the maid pick up a bucket and walk slowly towards her. It was very strange. But the next moment, a bucket of the same water was poured on the girl, and, of course, an obscene insult. The woman asked how she dared to pretend to be reincarnated in front of the Duke. She quietly replied that she only wanted to help, but the maid immediately shut her mouth. She again angrily asked the girl if she thought she could replace the red-haired one with such tricks. The woman pointed her finger at her, which was humiliating. She screamed furiously and added that it was impossible to raise a person who didn't even know his place, and that the girl should have been killed before she was born. But they had no choice. The girl squeezed her hand and tried to calm down. She had heard all these statements and words hundreds of times already. She remembered how in her past life people hated her and wanted to kill her, but she didn't want to be falsely accused of killing the Duke. She remembered him holding her hand in the hallway. She was pleased that he was able to support her despite his status. That's why she said that she had moved to another stage of incarnation. Although it is very difficult to understand whether this had any positive effect on everything that was happening. In fact, the girl never thought of taking the place of the red-haired one. She just needed a quiet life. This made her very sad. She, wiping away her tears, apologized to the head maid. She said with sadness in her voice that she was wrong and that this would never happen again. The head maid had already said her name with kindness, which was simply amazing. She asked the girl not to go to the capital if she received an invitation from the Duke, but the girl only opened her eyes wider and asked her again in surprise. The woman's tone immediately changed. She became rude again and said that the girl was not reincarnated. The girl was enchanted. Would she really go to the capital with this Duke? She liked this turn of events, although she hardly believed it. Her eyes grew many times larger. The girl could not believe that she would go to the capital with the Duke. The sparkles in her could be seen for kilometers. Rosetta was shining with happiness and joy, but then the girl noticed an angry woman in front of her, whose eyes were literally burning with anger. Her teeth were clenched tightly. She expected the girl to be submissive, but she was smiling happily. The head maid, having calmed down a little, calmly and confidently ordered her assistants to lock the girl in the room behind the stable. Rosetta was surprised by this. The girl remembered that there were a lot of centipedes in the room behind the stable. These thoughts terrified her. She screamed in fear and said that she didn't want to go there at all. It was clear that no one would listen. The younger maids came close to the girl and grabbed her hands. The woman added that the naughty child should be punished and she would talk to the Duke herself. The maids grabbed the girl by the arms and dragged her away, despite her desperate cries. She begged, repeating that she had made a mistake and asked not to lock her in that room. However, the head woman, with a cold expression on her face, dryly stated that she would only let her out when the Duke left for the capital. The woman frowned at the girl, her gaze full of discontent and disappointment. She thought about how this girl had clearly ruined everything, disrupting her carefully laid plans. Their master called the woman over and told her in a cold tone that the visiting Duke would die in the forest at dawn the following day. She froze for a moment, not immediately understanding what he was talking about. But her gaze betrayed her inner turmoil. The owner explained that the priest Felix had distorted the prophecy, manipulating its contents, and it was he who had prepared a trap to destroy the Duke, who had come here to find the Emperor's missing daughter. His voice was confident, and his eyes glittered with hidden malice. The woman was confused and did not know what to say in response. Her thoughts were in complete confusion. Meanwhile, the Duke calmly explained that it would not be possible to kill the girl, because a protective spell was cast on her, which protected her from mortal danger. The woman, suddenly changing her expression to a satisfied smile, noted that the spell would disappear as soon as the visiting Duke died. Her voice sounded with a sly note, as if she had found the key to solving her problem. The owner smiled too, and a look of satisfaction flashed in his eyes. He calmly explained that in this case, they would finally be able to get rid of the girl once and for all. The woman was perplexed as to how anyone could think that this girl had saved the Duke with her power. Her thoughts were seething with anger. How dare she interfere with their plans and hinder Karina's future? The woman realized that the red-haired girl was the daughter of a serious and influential man, and this significantly complicated the situation. Suddenly, the woman turned around sharply at the loud sound. Her gaze froze in confusion when she noticed that the maids who had previously held the girl down were now lying on the floor, as if they had been knocked down by an invisible force. The fair-haired Duke held the girl carefully in his arms, his gaze calm and focused. He looked around at everyone present with an attentive gaze and asked in a cold tone what they were going to do. The woman froze in surprise when her gaze landed on the Duke. She looked extremely confused, as if she had not expected to see him here and now. Suddenly, the woman felt her leg begin to give way and she staggered, trying to keep her balance. The woman suddenly fell to the floor, losing her balance, and in doing so, knocked over the bucket of water, spilling it all around. The water quickly spread across the floor, adding even more chaos to the situation. The girl raised her hands in surprise and placed them on his shoulders. Her gaze became softer, and she addressed the Duke in a gentle, almost whispering voice, trying to calm the situation. The boy looked at the girl tenderly, his eyes reflecting concern. With a slight tremor in his voice, he quietly asked if everything was okay with her. The girl met the guy's gaze and, smiling slightly, confidently said that she was okay, despite the tense situation. The guy carefully hugged the girl, his arm tightly wrapped around her shoulder, and his gaze slid with hostility over those around him, as if he was ready to face any threat. He looked at the maids, who were still sitting trembling with fear, and, not hiding his anger, asked them what they had done to the girl. The woman, looking at the Duke with alarm, hastened to explain that she was only trying to convey to the girl what she had done wrong and nothing more. The Duke looked at her with a reserved and stern expression, his voice cold as he asked, "Must an explanation always involve an attempt to deceive me?" The woman was confused, not knowing where to hide her gaze. She lowered her head and quickly told the Duke that the girl's education was their internal matter, and to interfere. But she was interrupted before she could finish. Suddenly, she noticed how the Duke was approaching her. His steps became more and more confident, and he was almost right in front of her. He looked at her with cold severity, and there was a threat in his voice. He asked her if she was sure that her attempts at deception would go unpunished, or if she was already prepared for the consequences. He added that Duke Hamfrey would do nothing if he killed her right there. The woman had only saved her life by avoiding unnecessary attention, and now she had to pay that debt to him. The blonde girl came closer, and the Duke, noticing her movement, turned around. At that time, the headmaid was sitting on the floor, watching what was happening in surprise, unable to understand what was happening. The girl took a step closer, and a mixture of fear and surprise was visible in her eyes, as if she could not believe what was happening. The Duke, noticing her approach, placed his hand on his knee and, looking at her with restraint, turned to her. In an instant, the Duke found himself on his knees in front of the girl. His movements were confident, and his gaze was soft. He extended his hand, and with a slight smile on his face, which seemed to soften all the tension of the moment, asked if she would agree to go with him to the capital. The girl, hearing his words, thought about it. The words of the headmaid immediately popped into her head, and she wondered what would happen if she agreed. What could this mean for her? The girl began to think that not only good things could await her in the future. She began to doubt that her dream of a peaceful life would come true, because everything could have turned out completely differently. Clenching her hands near her chest, she felt anxiety grip her heart. But if you think about it, maybe things will be better than they are now. Despite her anxiety, she knew that change could be a step forward, even if the path wasn't what she had imagined. She quietly placed her hand in his. Her gaze became more confident, and a slight smile appeared on her lips. Looking the Duke in the eyes, she calmly said that she would go with him. The Duke's gaze filled with a warm light, and the joy of her words was reflected on his face. A real glow of happiness seemed to light up in his eyes, as if all the weight of the last few days had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He felt relieved, and at that moment the world around him seemed to be filled with light. The Duke picked the girl up with a smile, and her heart skipped a few beats. She was a little surprised, and a moment of fear flashed in her eyes, not expecting such a turn of events. The girl, looking at the Duke a little confused, asked him to let her go, explaining that she was too heavy. Her voice sounded slightly awkward, and her blushing cheeks betrayed her embarrassment. The Duke smiled and gently told her she was mistaken, not noticing how her words had stirred the senior maid's anxiety. She looked at the scene with visible concern, her face distorted with distress, as if everything that was happening was beyond her comprehension. They left, and the three maids, who had been sitting and some even lying on the floor, began to rise slowly. Their movements were cautious, as if they were afraid to attract attention, but the tension in the air was palpable. One of the maids slowly clenched her fist in anger, her face contorted with rage, and she could hardly contain her emotions. She was full of rage because the girl had ruined all her plans. There was a fire of hatred in her eyes. She believed that she would pay for this, and her anger only grew stronger at the thought of the consequences. The mansion retained its exquisite beauty, but inside, cries filled with despair could be heard. One phrase stood out, shouted with obvious pain, "Why not me?" It echoed in the empty corridors, breaking the usual silence. The red-haired girl did not hold back her anger, and without hiding her fury, shouted, "Why is the Duke taking Rosetta to the capital and not me?" There was pain and bewilderment in her voice, as if she could not understand what she could have done wrong. The man tried to calm the girl down, gently asking her to be quiet, but panic was clearly visible on his face. Despite his words, the girl did not calm down and continued to scream, her voice becoming louder and more desperate. The black-haired man stated that this girl was still a fake and would only bring shame upon herself, but the other one was not going to back down. She continued to shout, not hiding her indignation, claiming that this was another reason why she deserved to be chosen. Suddenly, the noise attracted the Duke's attention. He went downstairs and, looking at what was happening, asked what was going on. The red-haired girl immediately turned to him, her voice full of despair and anger, ready to explain everything that was bothering her. The red-haired woman came closer, her face distorted with excitement, and with a confused expression on her lips, she asked if it was true that the Duke was taking the fair-haired girl to the capital, and not her. The man calmly confirmed her words, but she couldn't stand it and screamed, asking why. She claimed that she heard his lordship looking for the reincarnated one, and that he should have taken her, not the blonde. There was a desperate hurt in her voice. She angrily headed for the door, her steps confident and her face distorted with anger. The girl broke out of the room and declared that she would immediately tell the visiting Duke about this, unable to contain her anger and disappointment. Suddenly, the Duke grabbed the girl named Karina by the arm, blocking her way. In a serious and calm tone, he asked her to wait. His gaze was determined, as if he was trying to calm her down before explaining something. But the girl only defiantly told the Duke that he had always claimed that she was a true reincarnation. And if she really was a princess, then in her opinion, she deserved the love and respect of the people of the Empire, no matter what. Her words sounded decisive, full of confidence in her right. Then she asked him a question that seemed to anger the Duke greatly. "Why do you forbid me to tell the truth?" Her words were full of indignation and confusion, as if she could not understand why he did not want her to express her thoughts. The Duke pushed the girl away sharply and, without looking back, hurried away. She lost her balance from surprise and, barely having time to react, fell right into the arms of the dark-haired guy. He looked down at her with anger and asked her sharply if she remembered who had helped her unlock her power. After all, he added with contempt in his voice, she would never have become a reincarnated person if it weren't for the Duke's help. His words sounded like a reproach, making the girl feel the weight of what he said. The girl and the boy looked at the Duke in fear, stunned by his sudden outburst of anger. They could not believe that a usually reserved man could react so violently. Their eyes darted between each other, but neither of them knew what to do in this tense situation. The Duke, in a calmer tone, said that Rosetta would soon die, and only then would she be able to go to the capital. Hearing this, the girl immediately jumped up and ran to him, full of excitement and bewilderment. The Duke calmly replied that it would not take long, and changing the subject, suggested drinking a rare tea that was almost impossible to get in the Empire. The girl, a little confused, nevertheless decided to ask if the visiting Duke would join them. She added with a slight smile that she hoped the visiting Duke would enjoy the tea. There was a note of friendliness in her voice, but there was a flicker of worry in her eyes, as if she were trying to hide her true thoughts behind politeness. As they entered the hall, an unexpected scene appeared before their eyes. The visiting Duke was carefully holding Rosetta in his arms. The girl looked pale and weak, and her breathing seemed barely noticeable. The visiting Duke, slightly bowing his head, addressed the girl with a soft voice, asking her to tell him if she was cold, as he noticed her body was slightly trembling. However, the girl, slightly embarrassed, quickly replied that everything was fine. The red-haired girl was seething with anger, her gaze darting between the Dukes and the blonde girl. Her thoughts were racing through her head. Why wasn't it me? After all, she was a real reincarnated one, worthy of recognition and attention. Anger and resentment filled her, causing her to clench her fists so hard that her nails dug into her palms. The Duke looked at Karina with restraint, but with noticeable tension. His gaze showed an internal struggle. He silently asked her to stop, not to say too much. She was too angry. Her anger could get out of control. The Duke felt a cold wave of fear as he saw Karina extend her hand forward. Her face was twisted in rage, and her fingers trembled, as if gathering magical energy. It was obvious that she was preparing to begin casting a spell. Her angry eyes bored into the blonde girl. Karina, her gaze focused, made a decisive gesture, and as if by magic, a helicopter began to materialize in the air. The huge metal body floated up right in front of them, and its contours gleamed in the dim light of the room. The Duke's mouth fell open in surprise, unable to utter a word. It was so strange and unexpected that he couldn't immediately comprehend what was happening. The helicopter that had manifested itself right in front of him seemed like something unimaginable, beyond anything he had ever seen. The girl, still in the Duke's arms, calmly said that everything was fine, specifying that it was not a submarine, but a helicopter. She added with a smile that this word was probably unfamiliar to him. The Duke was still in shock from what was happening. The Duke was shocked. He could not believe that this monstrously complex and unusual construction was created by Lady Karina. He looked at her carefully, trying to understand that she was really capable of such a thing. The Duke thought about it. He looked at Karina, then at Rosetta, who was still in his arms. Doubts crept into his heart. If Karina could create such a complex thing, then her abilities were not just ordinary, but unique. Perhaps she really was reincarnated. The Duke pondered this, trying to figure it out. The prophecy he knew only spoke of a reincarnated one, but did not indicate that there had to be only one. The Duke reflected that no one in the mansion, including Humphrey, had mentioned the reincarnated woman, even though they were all aware of the prophecy. Their silence seemed strange, almost as if they were all part of some plan he knew nothing about. The boy was confused. He couldn't understand why the man was lying, especially when it was so obvious. His thoughts were jumbled, and every time he tried to find a logical explanation, it didn't add up. The boy thought with a smile that perhaps it was time to act. If everyone around him was so confused and dishonest, he had no choice but to use cunning and prepare his own trap. The boy looked at the red-haired girl with a smile, his eyes shining with curiosity and bewilderment. He seemed not to expect such a turn of events, but there was a shadow of doubt in his voice. "Are you also reincarnated?" he asked, as if he himself did not believe his words. The girl looked at him with a smile and calmly replied, "Yes, I am real. That is why I can summon a helicopter that transports people through the sky like a bird." Her words were full of confidence, and her gaze was calm. The visiting Duke looked at Mr. Humphrey with surprise, not expecting to see such abilities from the reincarnated one. He was amazed that the girl could summon a helicopter that transported people through the sky like a bird. The Duke felt panic creeping up on him as he was asked about the girl. He wasn't ready to reveal her existence, especially in this context. His mind immediately began racing, trying to find an excuse, but his eyes were nervous. The visiting Duke asked with a slight smile if his interlocutor really didn't know about the girl. He was looking for a reaction and watched as he lost himself in his thoughts, realizing that the questions were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The Duke began to say that he needed to conduct an investigation before heading to the capital with Rosetta, but a sharp voice interrupted him. The girl, feeling awkward, froze, and the interlocutors looked at each other, realizing that the situation had become even more confusing. The visiting Duke, with a smile on his face, said that it was impossible and added that he had no plans to wait any longer. He was confident in his actions and decisions, which only increased the tension in the room. He added that he had come to find the Emperor's missing daughter, and that any options would have to be considered, even if they were surprising or unexpected. His determination only increased the tension in the air, and everyone present began to feel that the situation was getting out of control. The Duke added that they had to understand that the lost princess was reincarnated, and that changed everything. That was why his search was so important, because such a person could have extraordinary powers that could change the course of events. The blonde girl was surprised by the Duke's confession. Her face turned slightly pale, and her eyes were filled with confusion. She did not expect that this whole situation would be connected to the missing princess and the reincarnated person. These thoughts tormented her mind, and the girl felt the tension inside her increase. She looked around, trying to understand how all these facts could be connected, and if there was a chance that she was the lost princess. The red-haired girl exclaimed with a joyful smile, "Is this true? And is she really the lost daughter of the Emperor?" Her face was shining with happiness. The visiting Duke watched the proceedings attentively, his gaze focused and penetrating, as if trying to understand every gesture and word spoken at that moment. The girl, unable to contain her excitement, was sincerely glad and happy from what she heard. The visiting Duke, remaining calm and unperturbed with a slight smile on his face, told the mister that both girls would be going to the capital. His voice sounded confident, and in his eyes there was not the slightest hint of doubt or disagreement. Mister, hearing this, froze for a moment, trying to comprehend the Duke's words. His gaze narrowed, and a shadow of confusion appeared on his face. Everything was not going according to plan, and he had to quickly decide how to react to this turn of events. Suddenly, an angry woman appeared in the room. It was the same senior maid. She suddenly shouted that there was no need for this, because the lost daughter of the Emperor was Karina. Her voice was filled with rage. She came closer, her face twisted with anger. With determination and aggression in her voice, she declared that the capital needed only her, and no one else. There was confidence in her words, but her gaze betrayed her anxiety. She knew that this was her last chance. The Duke, holding back, calmly asked the woman what evidence she had to prove that she was indeed the Emperor's lost daughter. His gaze was cold, and his tone was expressionlessly calm, as if he already knew in advance that her answer would be insufficient. The woman began to say that Freylein, who had fled with Beatrice, had left behind several important traces. However, her words sounded uncertain, and it seemed that she herself did not quite believe in her evidence. In fact, there was once such a story. A maid and a lady decided to run away from the Emperor. It was a long time ago, and many had already forgotten about this incident. However, for the woman standing before the Duke, this story remained important, like some old and secret key to her own ambitions. The maid turned out to be Lady Levi, which is why she knew the story so well. The woman was not just an ordinary maid, but had deep connections with the upper classes. It was her knowledge and experience that allowed her to manipulate the situation, playing on memories and old secrets. She added that when the Empress gave birth, she held Karina in her arms. Lady Levi told how she witnessed many secret meetings and events that pointed to the true origin. The girl's eyes filled with tears of joy, because she had always felt that her destiny was connected to something greater. Now, hearing these words, her faith was strengthened. She felt how her dreams and long-awaited truth were finally becoming reality. The maid stopped, a little puzzled by her words, but the girl, holding back her emotions, added that it was not anger, but simply an unpleasant smell. She tried to maintain respect, but still could not hide her displeasure. The Duke gritted his teeth, trying to hold back his anger. It all seemed confusing, and he knew the situation was far more complex than he could have imagined. All these secrets and hidden connections complicated his plan, but he knew he had to keep a cool head despite the intensity of his emotions. The visiting Duke seemed to have no doubts. He watched with a slight smile as the girl and the woman fell into his trap, as if not understanding how complicated this game was. His calm was almost frightening, because behind this external confidence there was hidden a far from simple game with fates. The red-haired girl ran up to the Duke with a smile, her eyes shining with hope. She took his hands and eagerly asked him to take her to the capital. Her voice was full of excitement and confidence, as if this moment was the most important in her life. The girl added with a smile that she was a real princess, and that now that everything was so clear, the Duke should take her to her father. There was so much confidence in her words that even the most doubtful could believe her words. But the guy threw her hands off and said it wasn't that he didn't believe her, but that the situation was much more complicated than she thought. He was very calm. He added that it was too early to draw conclusions, and everything would be decided by the high priest of the Azra Temple. Only he would be able to determine exactly who the Emperor's real daughter really was, and what they should do next. The blonde girl was at a loss. She felt upset because she could now find herself in a situation where Karina could take her place if it really turned out that she was the lost daughter of the Emperor. Yes, if this turns out to be true, then there will be no point in her going to the capital. Karina will have much more rights, and the blonde girl realized that her dreams of the capital may not come true. While the girl was sad, the Duke added that this is why it is important to act carefully in such a situation and not rush to conclusions. Everything that happens can be part of a more complex game, and you need to be sure of every step. He added that in that case, both girls would go to the capital to find out the truth and not miss important details. Each of them has a role in this story, and only time will tell which of them is actually the lost daughter of the Emperor. The girl and the guy entered a small but very cozy room. She looked around the room in surprise, unable to believe that such beautiful and carefully designed spaces exist. Harmony reigned in every corner, and unusual design details created an atmosphere of coziness and tranquility. The guy calmly turned to the girl, advising her to take a bath first, as there was warm water in the room that would help her relax after the stress she had experienced. The girl was a little embarrassed at the thought of having to appear in such a state in front of the Duke. She felt awkward, because she was not used to appearing in such a state, especially in such a situation. However, the understanding that the bath would help her relax and tidy herself up calmed her down a little. The girl turned an apologetic look to the Duke and, without waiting for an answer, headed towards the bathroom. She felt her cheeks begin to burn with embarrassment, but tried not to show it. It was unusual, but a necessary action that would help her feel more comfortable. The Duke was deep in thought, holding the pen carefully in his hand. He wrote the letter with restraint, expressing his doubts and joy at the possible meeting with the Emperor's lost daughter. The words seemed heavy. He weighed each sentence, understanding how important this information was for the future. The boy was at a loss. He could not understand why Duke Hamfrey was still dragging his feet and not rushing to cooperate, despite all his assurances. Besides, the situation was becoming more and more confusing. He had found two people who both claimed to be reincarnated. Duke Hamfrey, who concealed the truth, created an atmosphere of uncertainty and suspicion. All his actions and words looked like parts of a carefully planned game. The situation became increasingly complicated, especially when Lady Levi appeared, claiming to have raised the proposed princess. The Duke, having finished writing the letter, carefully wrapped it and put it in an envelope. He checked all the details and decided that he could now send it to the Emperor. This step was important, since the contents of the letter could affect the further development of events. The Duke, as he was finishing the letter, thought that many details would be better left for a personal meeting with the Emperor. He knew that words through the envoys would not convey the full importance of what was happening, and decided that when they arrived at the palace, he would tell everything. The Emperor, sitting in his luxurious study, carefully read the letter delivered to him by his assistant. The letter was full of details, describing events that he found difficult to imagine. The unusual words and mysterious hints made him think. The Emperor's eyes narrowed as he scanned the lines, his expression focused. He knew there was more to this letter than just a report, and each paragraph raised more questions in his mind. The Emperor sat on his throne and two men stood in front of him. He turned to one of them, pointing to the letter, and asked him to look at the contents. The man silently accepted the letter and began to read, while the other waited impatiently for his reaction. The men read the letter in amazement. One of them was shocked that Duke Hamfrey was apparently biding his time, and the other was shocked that two girls were claiming to be reincarnated. This discovery challenged all their previous assumptions, and both could not understand what exactly was happening. One of the men, still stunned, asked, "What do you mean by that?" The other more calmly replied, "The prophecy didn't say that there could only be one reincarnated person." Both were surprised. They wondered if Lady Levi was the same maid who had disappeared with the Empress many years ago. She was supposed to bring the princess to the palace immediately after her birth, but she vanished without a trace. Perhaps this was not a coincidence, and her connection to the missing princess was much more significant. One man continued that it was all too suspicious, too many inconsistencies, but the other stopped him, telling him to calm down. He reminded him that everything needed to be examined carefully, without jumping to conclusions, and that the situation was not yet clear. He added that the Azra Temple would reveal the truth to them, and only there would they be able to find out who the reincarnated princess really was. The man confirmed his words and added that the Azra Temple will not only reveal the true princess, but also show the place of the one who is trying to deceive everyone by posing as her. He said that he will not leave this without consequences, because the fake must answer for her actions. The fair-haired man, turning to the Emperor, asked if he knew about Marquise Kalika Caron. The Emperor, not hiding his irritation, replied that he would immediately send a messenger to obtain more detailed information about Marquise Kalika Caron. He made it clear that this matter should not be ignored. Marquise Kalika Caron, Empress Beatrice's younger sister, has always remained in the shadows despite her relationship with such an influential figure. Unlike her older sister, who became empress and left her mark on history, despite the obvious differences in their personalities and life paths, twins like Marquise Kalika Caron and Empress Beatrice were inseparable souls. There was something special about their relationship, despite the outward detachment. After the disappearance of the princess, Marquise Kalika Caron increasingly encountered those who tried to pass themselves off as the Empress's real daughter. These false pretenders undermined her peace, and she, feeling disappointed and hurt, decided to isolate herself, locked herself in her territories. Shaitan replied that it was all the fault of the swindlers who were making it difficult to find the truth. He was sure that the truth had to be revealed as soon as possible. Only then would the soul of Empress Beatrice, restless because of the loss of her daughter, find peace. The Emperor's gaze was heavy, full of sadness and disappointment. He felt the burden of responsibility for what was happening, and he could not help but think of the pain his people were experiencing because of the princess's disappearance. He remembered his wife, the one who was so vivid in his memory. She had beautiful long hair, a soft pink color, like the morning sunrise, and her blue eyes sparkled like two clear lakes. Her pretty face always made him feel peaceful and loved. The room was decorated in dark blue tones, with a slight transition to light blue, which gave it a cozy and calm atmosphere. A light light, breaking through the window, barely illuminated the space. On the huge bed slept a small blonde girl, her hair like threads of gold. She covered her eyes with her hands, trying to hide from the sunlight that was breaking through the window. Despite her fatigue, she knew that the head maid would not forgive her if she did not get up and start working early. The girl sighed, realizing that it was not worth putting it off. She slowly got up and sat on the bed, looking around. Her eyes still couldn't get used to the light, and she was a little surprised to see a luxurious room decorated with expensive fabrics and exquisite furniture. However, her thoughts soon returned to reality. She stood at the threshold of the bathroom, looking at the huge bathtub, surrounded by fresh flowers that added a special atmosphere to the room. A question flashed through her mind. Was she really allowed to use this luxurious place? She looked at herself in the mirror, noticing how her dress fit perfectly, emphasizing the ease of her movements. The white color with blue elements harmoniously combined, giving her a feeling of airiness and freshness. This was completely new for her. She had never felt so gentle and beautiful before. The girl looked in the mirror and her face darkened. The new outfit, the luxurious bathroom, the bright room, all of this seemed temporary to her. No matter how she tried to tune in to the positive, thoughts about the dirty room, to which she would still have to return, did not leave her. Coming out of the bathroom, the girl stopped in the hallway, lost in thought. She was going to thank the Duke for providing her with such luxury, but then a strange thought overtook her. Where did he go? The girl slowly lowered herself onto the luxurious bed, her gaze sliding over the soft pillows and cozy interior. She smiled softly, feeling a little strange but at the same time comfortable in this place. Lost in thought, she wondered if she could just sit here while she waited for him. The girl quickly jumped out of bed, her face flushed with shame. She couldn't believe that she had fallen asleep in the Duke's own bed while he wasn't there. In a panic, she looked around the room, checking if she had left any traces of her presence. The girl rushed around the room in panic, not knowing what to do. She heard footsteps, but could not understand where they were coming from. When she decided to go beyond the walls, the dark and frightening silence of the corridor appeared before her. The girl froze when she noticed him in the room. She stood there, not knowing what to do. At least, she hadn't expected to see him so calm. The Duke was sleeping on the sofa, his face relaxed and his breathing even. The room was silent. Only the light from the window illuminated his figure. The thought of punishment began to torment her. The girl felt her anxiety growing, but at the same time, she could not tear her gaze away from his calm face. The questions that did not give her peace were replaced by the same thoughts. How would he react? What would he think if he woke up and found her here? The Duke rose slowly, his gaze sleepy but slightly surprised. He stared at the girl for a few seconds, not quite realizing what was happening, until he came to his senses and remembered her unexpected appearance. The guy, still a little sleepy but curious, asked why she was on the floor. She, looking remorseful, replied that she felt guilty. She thought it was inappropriate to occupy his bed, and now she was ready to be punished, because she had committed a mortal sin. The girl continued to escalate the situation, her voice trembling with excitement, and she repeated again how she could make the Duke sleep on the sofa when his place was in the bed. There was a mixture of shame and confusion in her eyes. She felt that she had violated some important order. The Duke sat down slowly next to the girl, his gaze calm and his face reflecting a slight smile. He looked at her carefully, trying to calm her down. He said that she had done nothing wrong, and he himself offered her to take the bed, as she needed to rest. The Duke added with a slight smile that he had done so because he wanted to, and it was his personal decision. His words were calm, but there was confidence in them. The girl looked at him in surprise. Although her internal tension had eased a little, she still couldn't fully believe that everything was really that simple. But the Duke's gaze was sincere, and she realized that she shouldn't worry too much. The Duke gently sat the girl down on the sofa and gently told her not to apologize anymore, because there was really nothing wrong with it. His voice was calm. Rosetta didn't know and didn't understand what to do. The guy's mood was quite calm. The Duke looked at her carefully, and his expression became softer. He said carefully that it seemed that she really was used to asking for forgiveness for everything that happened to her. The girl, looking down, quietly replied that she was often scolded, and it had become a habit. The Duke, gently squeezing her hand, looked into her eyes and said that he would not allow anyone to hurt her again. He promised that neither the head maid nor anyone else in this mansion would harm her again. His voice was firm and confident, as if to say that she was now safe. The guy looked at her fragile figure with pain in his eyes, seeing traces of the suffering she had endured on her body. He noticed scars that spoke of her past, of what she had been through. A mixture of sympathy and anger arose in his heart, but he understood that she needed time to believe in herself. The girl agreed with the Duke with determination in her voice that she would go to the capital. But doubts were seething inside her. She knew that she had to hide her true intentions. Although her appearance was calm, emotions were boiling inside her. To escape, to start a new life. The guy looked at the girl with a slight smile and asked if she was hungry. He suggested having breakfast together, hoping that it would help her relax and distract her from her heavy thoughts. The maids worked around the table, carefully placing various dishes. Each treat was beautifully presented, and the air was filled with the aroma of freshly prepared dishes, inviting everyone to dine. The girl looked in surprise at the variety of dishes that appeared before her. Baked chicken, juicy steak, exquisite shrimp, canapes with various fillings, pasta, various sauces, and even crab shown on the table. The Duke carefully seated her on a chair in the center of a long table that was groaning with dishes. The girl looked around in bewilderment and, not believing her eyes, quietly asked if she was really allowed to eat all this. He nodded with a slight smile, confirming her assumption. The girl began to carefully taste the dishes, and with each bite her eyes became brighter. She thought that it was incredibly delicious. She had never eaten anything like it before. The Duke watched her with interest and, interrupting her thoughts, calmly asked if she had a last name. The girl lowered her head a little and, sighing quietly, replied that she had no last name. She explained that the head maid had raised her as an abandoned child and had always claimed that she was from some humble family. According to the maid, she had no last name at all. The guy looked at her with a slight smile and calmly said that the maid was wrong. His confident tone made the girl look up at him, but she didn't say anything. She just looked at him with distrust, as if she didn't believe what she heard. The Duke calmly added that there was a possibility that she might be the Emperor's daughter. Hearing this, the girl suddenly froze, her hand clutching the spoon frozen in midair. The girl lowered her head and quietly said that she could not believe it. She doubted that it was possible, because what kind of father would abandon his own child? Her voice trembled, and her gaze was full of doubt and bitterness. She could not understand why, if it was true, she was left alone in such a situation. It was hard and painful for her to realize that her family could allow such a fate to befall her. The thought that she could be abandoned tormented her heart and brought unbearable pain. It was too much for her fragile soul, too unfair to be true. She smiled softly, trying to hide her bitterness, and said that perhaps it was better to be alone. Her voice was calm, but there was a weariness in it, as if she had long since resigned herself to being alone. He addressed the girl softly, asking her not to call him Duke anymore, but to address him simply by his first name. The girl looked up in surprise, not immediately understanding why he had suggested such a thing. She was a little confused because she was used to strict formalities. The guy calmly noted that he was going to call her by her first name because it would be more honest. His voice was soft, as if he was trying not to scare her. Then he added that she could call him Identino. The girl folded her arms near her chest, feeling slightly embarrassed. She didn't know what to do in this situation and felt unsure. Thoughts flashed through her head, but they were all confused. The unexpected offer made her think. She repeated his name softly, feeling how strange it sounded on her lips. It was strange to address a complete stranger that way, especially when he was offering such closeness. Her heart sank a little in awkwardness. She looked at him, and the guy, noticing her gaze, responded with a smile. This moment seemed magical, as if everything around froze and time stopped. In his eyes, there was not only interest, but also some indescribable warmth. Suddenly, there was a scream that pierced the silence, and someone outside began calling his name. As soon as the door swung open, a red-haired beast flew into the room. She said with a smile on her face that she had come to meet him. Her confident step and bright expression instantly attracted his attention. The red-haired girl approaching the table was about to address the Duke, but noticing the girl, she stopped. Her gaze softened a little, and she studied her with interest. The girl in response tensed up a little, not knowing what to expect from the new company. The girl, noticing that the situation was becoming tense, said with slight displeasure that she had come only to see his lordship. She had been told that breakfast would be held in privacy, but as it turned out, there was already an uninvited guest. The girl quickly stood up from her chair, politely greeted the red-haired lady, and, bowing her head, apologized for disturbing her. The guy sat the girl back down on the chair, holding her gently, and with a smile told the red-haired lady that he thanked her for her concern, but he already had company for breakfast. She asked in surprise if Rosetta had served him food, since she was so often busy with her own affairs that she sometimes did not notice which of the maids was performing such a task. The girl came closer to the Dugoigi and said firmly that this was enough. Now the Duke would eat with her, and she asked the maid to stop and get out of here. Rosetta, somewhat puzzled, nodded, and without saying a word, began to leave. While Rosetta was leaving, the red-haired girl, having settled herself on a chair, looked around the table with interest and noticed that everything looked very appetizing. She added that if the Duke wanted something, she was ready to help. However, she was suddenly interrupted and she stopped, looking at the one who spoke. But the guy calmly told her that the place was already taken by another girl. The red-haired girl instantly became embarrassed. Her face slightly reddened, and she quickly replied that she would leave immediately, not wanting to create inconvenience. The guy said with growing anger that Rosetta had not yet had breakfast, and that the red-haired girl should immediately take another chair. His voice was stern, and the girl, feeling the tension, quickly moved to the free seat, avoiding further conflicts. The red-haired girl, although with obvious displeasure, nevertheless agreed with the guy and stood up from the stranger's chair. She frowned a little, but realizing that it was pointless to resist, she quietly moved away, leaving a place for Rosetta. The boy pushed back his chair and moved it slightly, then turned to the blonde girl. His voice was calm, but there was an urgency in it. He invited her to sit down and continue eating breakfast, making it clear that the situation with Rosetta had to be resolved. The blonde girl carefully sat down on the chair and quietly thanked the Duke. Her voice sounded slightly embarrassed, but she tried not to show her emotions. Now she felt a little more confident, because he was clearly on her side. The red-haired girl, as if forgetting about everything, happily addressed the Duke, declaring that she had prepared pumpkin stew especially for him. Her eyes shone with pride, and her smile seemed so sincere that it could embarrass anyone. She wanted the Duke to pay attention to her. The redhead proudly added that pumpkin stew was the best dish of the Duke's chef. She confidently stated that no one had ever remained indifferent to its taste, and expressed the hope that the Duke would try at least a little of it. The redhead said with confidence that she hoped that the pumpkin stew would be to the taste of even the visiting Duke. Her eyes shone with pride for the dish that she had taken so much trouble to present. Edentino, not wanting to offend her, slowly raised the spoon with the aromatic liquid to his lips. He took a small sip, feeling the warm taste of the stew. Edentino carefully tasted the stew, but it clearly did not impress him. He offered the blonde girl a taste to get her opinion. She was a little confused, but still agreed. Rosetta was surprised by such warmth from the guy. The blonde carefully tasted the stew and unexpectedly smiled. The taste was surprisingly delicate, with a bright pumpkin aroma and light spicy notes. She admitted that she had never eaten anything like it. The red-haired girl was pleased with her reaction. The redhead felt a slight disappointment. Her plans to spend time alone with the Duke were clearly falling apart because of the blonde guest. But she quickly hid her emotions behind a smile and decided to turn the conversation to her advantage. She asked if they managed to find the person who attacked the Duke. The Duke calmly replied that the culprit of the attack had not yet been found, but he had passed on all the necessary information to Humphrey. On his part, it was a matter of time, because the Duke was sure that the truth would soon be known. The red-haired woman frowned slightly, but immediately changed her expression to one of interest, nodding her head. The red-haired woman cautiously noted that their territory was often visited by swindlers who used magic similar to the one the Duke had spoken of. She offered her services in the investigation, claiming that she knew how to expose such swindlers. The Duke nodded, confirming her words, and said that he knew exactly what he was talking about. A small smile appeared on his face, which seemed to say more than words. He was confident in his words, and this added confidence to his whole appearance. The redhead said with a smile that it wasn't that the guy could have made a mistake, but that if Hamfrey couldn't find the culprit, the reputation of the duchy would suffer greatly. She looked happy, but it was clear why she was pretending to be happy. The boy looked at the girl in surprise when he heard her say the Duke's name as if she didn't care about him. He gently told her to be careful with her assessments of the nobles until her status as a princess was officially confirmed, just like with him. The girl added sadly that her status was now second only to her father and brother, looking sad as if her place in this world was no longer so important. She returned her smile and, after a moment's thought, agreed with the Duke. She said quietly that, in return, she would call him by his first name. A slight gratitude sounded in her voice, and she felt as if a weight had been lifted from her. For a moment, there was silence between them. The boy said, with a slight sadness and calmness in his voice, that he would prefer that she did not do it. Closing his eyes for a moment, he continued, as if there was some unspoken request in his words that remained unclear to her. He added that until they got to know each other better, it would be better to keep some distance. The blonde girl watched their conversation in surprise, not knowing how to react to his words. She felt that there was something more to their relationship than just politeness. The girl wondered if he really wanted to say that they were close enough to allow himself such frankness. Doubt flickered in her eyes, but she did not say anything out loud. Her thoughts were confused, and she could not understand how to perceive all this. Had he really changed so much? The girl was excited about this thought, because she had such a reliable friend whom she could confide in. This feeling of warmth and confidence filled her heart. She felt how she was becoming more and more attached to him every day, and this brought her joy. The girl was heading towards the carriage when she was told that their journey would be shorter thanks to a magical tunnel. This meant that the journey would not take long, and she wondered with curiosity how exactly this tunnel worked. The girl sat in the carriage, looking out the window with a slight sadness on her face. Her thoughts were occupied with the fact that she was finally saying goodbye to this place. In her hands, she held all the things that had been given to her over these 16 years in the estate. Something old, something new. But each of these things carried with it memories and experiences. She pulled back the curtain and, despite the twilight, stared out the window, trying to memorize every detail. The silhouettes of trees flashed in the distance, and the sky was beginning to darken beyond the horizon. The flashes of lights from the windows of houses she had once seen seemed so far away now. Ahead of her was a vast world full of new opportunities and unexplored roads. It was like an open book, the pages of which beckoned her. There were to be many amazing encounters, surprises, and adventures. The girl thought that those who had once mocked her were riding in the carriage, and now she had to leave everything behind. Her heart sank from the memories, but she understood that staying in the past was not her path. There was a new world ahead, and she knew that despite the pain, she had to move on. The girl continued to look out the window with confidence, realizing that despite everything that had happened before, she was ready to face the future with hope and strength, thanks to her new friend. The girl looked out the window, and the man driving the carriage said that they would soon arrive at the tunnel. There was a calm confidence in his voice, as if this was something ordinary. But to the girl, the coming moment seemed something special. The girl watched the road with anticipation, her gaze fixed on the window, and she waited with bated breath for them to finally arrive. The excitement was growing, because new opportunities and perhaps changes were waiting for her ahead. This was a special moment. The palace looked majestic. Its 3 floors and many high towers rose into the sky, as if personifying power and wealth. Magnificent stained glass windows reflected the rays of the sun, and the roofs were covered with dark tiles that contrasted with the snow-white walls. The carriage approached the palace, and the crowd of people around excitedly shouted and applauded, greeting the lost princess. However, despite their enthusiastic cries, none of them knew who was actually hiding behind the carriage windows. The emperor stood in the center of the square, surrounded by his protectors, who kept a close eye on the crowd. Despite their presence, the people continued to shout, clapping without ceasing, expressing their admiration and joy at the return of the princess. The emperor stood outside, his expression calm, but deep inside he felt a surge of joy. His daughter, lost for many years, had finally returned home. Despite his outward reserve, there was room in his heart for pride and relief. The defenders approached the carriage and, respectfully opening its doors, politely stepped aside. The blonde girl, having slowed her pace a little, slowly walked out to meet them. Her face was calm, but her eyes showed a mixture of excitement and determination. She glanced around at the crowd, which was still applauding wildly. She looked truly wonderful. Her long white hair, with a delicate pink tint playing at the tips, fell to her shoulders, adding lightness and elegance to her. Her deep blue eyes radiated calm and confidence, and her dress in white and blue tones emphasized her sophistication. The Emperor stood there, spellbound, his eyes wide open, not believing his eyes. His face was a mixture of surprise and confusion, as if he was trying to comprehend that it was actually his daughter standing before him. His gaze was filled with questions, but there was no anger or accusations on his face. The girl stood before the Emperor, and her appearance was so similar to his wife that it seemed as if she was really the one he had lost. Snow-white hair, a delicate pink tint at the tips, and her deep blue eyes. All this reminded him of the image of his beloved wife, whom he had been looking for so long. The girl took a few steps, her movements full of grace and uncertainty. The huge steps leading to the Emperor and his defenders opened up before her, and each step seemed heavy, as if fate itself was deciding which path she would have to take. Suddenly, literally in an instant, the girl felt someone knock her down. She barely managed to keep her balance when a red-haired woman appeared in front of her, running towards the Emperor with a smile. She exclaimed joyfully, as if the whole scene was just part of the celebration. The redhead ran up to the Emperor with a bright smile and without hesitation hugged him tightly, happily calling him Daddy. The Emperor was left somewhat confused, not expecting such a turn of events. His eyes widened slightly in surprise and he froze in place, not knowing how to react. The Emperor still couldn't understand what was going on when his gaze caught on another figure rapidly approaching him. It was a woman, and she, noticing his surprised face, began to say something, calling him, but her words were unclear due to the noise in the crowd. The Emperor stood in a stupor, unable to comprehend what was happening. The woman, kneeling before him, tried to explain with obvious desperation in her voice that everything she had done was at the behest of the late Empress. She admitted that she had hidden the princess, fearing for her safety and future. The Emperor, standing before her with his mouth wide open, could not believe his ears. He tried to comprehend what was happening, but could not find the words. The woman, as if under the weight of her confessions, added that if he had read the letter his late wife had left, he should have understood her actions. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she said, her voice breaking, that she could not believe that the princess had returned to the palace. There was genuine pain and relief in her words. She added that the Empress would be overjoyed to know that her daughter had finally returned. The red-haired woman looked at the Emperor with a smile, proudly declaring that she was his daughter. However, he could not believe his ears. In front of him stood a woman who did not look like his daughter, and his gaze slid over her face, trying to find at least some features reminiscent of the late Empress. The man expected his heart to overflow with joy and his tears to be unable to hold back. But instead, his soul was filled with incomprehension and anxiety. He looked at the girl who called herself his daughter and could not believe it. Everything was so absurd, so unexpected. He had been waiting for this meeting. Now, when she hugged him, he didn't feel that long-awaited warmth that he should have felt at that moment. His heart didn't respond to her touch, as if there was an invisible barrier between them. He tried to understand why this was happening, because everyone was waiting for this day. He looked around and saw everyone crying with happiness, tears streaming down the faces of those who were waiting for her return. People were happy, but inside he was empty, and he could not understand why he could not share their feelings. Their eyes shone with relief and joy, but his heart remained cold. The girl looked at the Emperor with a slight smile, then, as if a little embarrassed, asked him to hug her. Her words were quiet, but there was such a sincere request in them that they immediately touched the man's heart. But he could not believe that his blood flowed in her. The entire nation burst into joyful cries when they saw this touching picture. Emotions overwhelmed the people because there had not been such a resurrection of hope for a long time, and everyone felt that something great was happening at this moment. Behind them stood a fair-haired girl, quietly watching what was happening. Her gaze was calm and focused, as if she was removed from this whole stormy scene. At the same time, the Duke could not tear his eyes away from her. His gaze was fixed. He couldn't understand why he had confused this girl with his dead wife. Her gaze didn't have what he was looking for, although her features seemed so familiar. This feeling came over him like a strange anxiety, as if something important was eluding him. The Duke, without looking back, headed into the house, and the others, following him, began to disappear into the shadows of the large gate. The blonde girl stood there, not knowing what to do. She felt like a stranger among these people, as if her presence was out of place. The inside of the house was filled with elegant luxury. High ceilings topped with exquisite chandeliers, walls decorated with antique paintings and gilded frames. Expensive carpets covered the floor, and soft sofas and armchairs created an atmosphere of comfort amidst excessive luxury. The Emperor stood with an inscrutable expression, his gaze serious and focused. Behind him, with an expression of confidence, stood a young man who looked very much like the Duke himself. His features were almost identical, which left no doubt. This was probably his son. Before them stood two men, the Emperor's chief aides, long immersed in matters that concerned the government and the internal politics of the palace. Their presence was significant, and they both watched the proceedings intently, as if they knew that any moment might be decisive. An older man with long gray hair stepped forward and, bowing his head low, introduced himself. His voice was deep and calm, as if he had been saying it for many years. "I am Father Gregory," he said, and there was not only formality in his words, but also a certain warmth. He quietly but insistently asked each of the girls to take one of them. Each cup seemed special, and despite the seriousness of the situation, there was something subtly ritualistic in the gesture. The redhead, without thinking, immediately began to wash her hands with a smile on her face, as if it was something she was used to. She felt confident, even in such an unfamiliar environment. While the other girl stood there confused, not knowing what to do, the girl began to wash her hands, lost in thought. She noticed that washing hands from such precious bowls only happened during a very important event, and this sensation emphasized the unusualness of the moment. Her mind tried to comprehend what exactly was happening around her. She looked up as she heard a familiar girl shout something at her with a smile. The sound of a penetrating voice brought her back to reality. The girl looked confident. Her words were full of enthusiasm, and she seemed to be looking for attention, ready to break the silence. She shouted that the cup responded to the red-haired girl, and it really was the princess. Everyone around froze. Tension hung in the air, and the gazes of those present turned to her, waiting for confirmation of her words. The girl, feeling the attention on herself. They knelt before her and told her with respect that the cup had blessed her with prosperity and long life. It was a sign that no one could ignore. The entire room fell silent, and all eyes turned to the girl who now seemed to be a princess. The blonde girl held her cup in her hands, but her face was full of doubt and sadness. She felt the weight of this whole moment falling on her, realizing that her future would now change forever. All these looks, expectations, and the unknown in front of her seemed much more difficult. The Duke watched the proceedings closely, his gaze focused and a little wary. He reflected on how only a few dared to mess with magical artifacts. Such powers do not forgive mistakes, and everyone who steps on this path. The Duke tensed even more, realizing the gravity of the situation. High-class artifacts like this cup were not only powerful, but also extremely dangerous. Their magic was so ancient and complex that verifying one's lineage was a real challenge. The Duke considered this, realizing that this added another layer of complexity to the situation. By transporting a person to his world, someone who regularly used the cup could influence its magic, altering its response. This opened up entirely new possibilities for manipulation and interference. The Duke smiled at the girl's good upbringing, and although his words were full of respect, she could not help but respond proudly. With a slight smile on her face, she praised herself, adding that this was not her first confession. Apparently, it had become habitual for her to value and acknowledge her own achievements. The Emperor stood in the shadows, watching what was happening, and could not believe his eyes. He felt mixed feelings overflowing inside him: joy, surprise, and confusion. Everything seemed so unreal, as if he was in another world, where all the usual rules and logic disappeared. The red-haired girl did not hide her joy. Her face was shining with happiness. She felt that now that she was recognized as part of the royal family, she could finally be safe. No one would dare touch her or insult her because her status was untouchable. The woman standing in the street couldn't hold back her tears. She said through her sobs that the Empress had always dreamed of the princess being brought up properly. And now that this moment had come, she felt a huge mixture of pain and pride. The woman, still crying, said in a restrained voice that she had hidden the princess from the world, fulfilling the Empress's last will. But even after all these years, she could not get rid of the feeling of guilt. There was always a heaviness in her heart, because she knew how much it would mean to the Empress. The man stood motionless, his gaze calm and focused, as if he was trying to comprehend everything that was happening around him. He did not say a word, but his silence and calm spoke volumes. Every movement, every glance seemed carefully thought out. He remembered the letter she had sent him, full of pain and regret. In it, she had asked for forgiveness, explaining that she could not allow her child to be sacrificed for the sake of the empire, even if it had been reborn. It had been a difficult decision for her, but at that moment she had considered it the only right one. The man sighed heavily as he recalled those words. They weighed on his heart, like a reminder of how often he had to choose between duty and personal feelings. And now that it had all become clear, he felt that this was not just a random chance, but a true destiny. He wanted to turn it all back, to a time when decisions didn't seem so hard, when he could have prevented the consequences that were now falling upon everyone. Memories of those days when he and the Empress had discussed the princess's future came flooding back into his mind. He would do anything to keep her from running away, to keep her from disappearing from his life again, to keep her destiny from being destroyed, as had happened in the past. Every move she made, every look she gave him, everything reminded him that he had to not only protect, but also find a way to restore what had been lost. The blonde girl stood to the side, her gaze focused, but it was not only alarmed, but also a deep understanding that what was happening was only part of something much larger. She silently watched every movement around her, trying to figure out where this was all leading. The blonde girl continued to watch the Emperor, surprised by his restraint. He stood among everyone, his face calm, but his eyes did not show the joy she expected to see. Even after his daughter, lost and returned, stood before him, the blonde girl looked at the Emperor with a slight smile. A thought was born in her heart that despite his cold demeanor, what was important was not how he reacted. After all, the truth was not in how each individual perceived the world, but in who was around. Her world was falling apart, and she felt the heavy weight of loneliness falling on her shoulders. Being abandoned by parents is not just a loss. It is like losing a part of yourself, your place in this world. It was painful for the girl to realize that those who were supposed to be her support turned out to be bad. The Duke, restraining his curiosity, reminded the Emperor of his intention to give the princess something special when they met. It was a reminder of the importance of this moment, not only as a meeting, but also as a gesture that could symbolize acceptance and a new chapter in their relationship. The Emperor pictured his son, Demian, in his mind. He had always been proud of his tough character, his chestnut hair and bright red eyes, which gave him a stern and imperious appearance. His features were carved with such precision that it seemed as if the Emperor himself was looking into a mirror, but in the face of his son. The girls both froze in anticipation. The red-haired one happily asked if it was a crown, because the only thing that would suit the princess of the kingdom best. Looking at her, it seemed that she was too spoiled and stupid for the world around her. She came closer and still saw the guy, which surprised her very much because it was her brother. He looked at her calmly and sternly, his hands nervously folded. The girl goes to meet him with a smile because she sees him for the first time. She folded her hands in anticipation and reminded him of the gift and asked with a big smile what it was. Her eyes literally shone with happiness, and her whole body trembled in anticipation of something luxurious and majestic from her brother, whom she had not seen for so long. The guy stood motionless, his gaze calm and focused, as if he was trying to comprehend everything that was happening around him. He didn't say a word, but his silence and calm spoke volumes. One might think that he was an exact copy of the Emperor, with the same character, but the guy still thought a little, angrily emphasized that he did not want to give the girl anything at all. His eyes were burning and his hair fell on his face, giving moments of madness. This act was quite strange and rude, but no one could understand the young man. The girl immediately ran up to him and began to beg him in her squeaky voice and asked what he was talking about, because he had been waiting for the moment for so long to see his lost sister. The man watched the scene and his thoughts returned to the past. He remembered how Prince Damien had once been in a bad mood. Then, in a fit of rage, his harshness had turned into merciless cruelty. The man approached the girl with restraint and said that the prince would give her the gift later, considering the moment inappropriate. However, this caused a flash of anger in the girl. Her blue eyes flashed with indignation, and the emotions she had been holding back for so long began to take over. The girl could not hide her irritation and continued to be capricious. Her voice became louder and louder, and her movements became more and more abrupt. She reproached everyone around her for disrespect, claiming that her dignity as a princess was being ignored. The man, apparently taken aback by her sharp reaction, calmly but with a hint of uncertainty in his voice, said that the gift would be given to her under more appropriate circumstances in a formal setting. He tried to smooth over the tension. The girl could not understand why the gift could not be given right now. After all, she was now officially recognized as a princess, and she had every reason to expect the corresponding treatment. The red-haired girl had already begun to think about how to complain to her father about this injustice. In the end, this day became a special moment. After 16 years, father and daughter met for the first time. The red-haired girl was sure that now that she was back, her father would fulfill her every wish. She ran up to the emperor happily, but her steps slowed when he suddenly extended his hand in front of her, as if placing an invisible barrier between them. His gesture was stern, and his expression was cold. The red-haired girl froze in place, surprised by such behavior. The emperor looked at the red-haired girl with restraint and calmly said that the identification process was not yet complete and that she should not rush. His words were full of severity, but his tone remained calm. The girl, who had been confident in her position until then, froze. He turned without looking back and slowly walked towards the exit, walking up the stairs with dignity. His figure, moving into the darkness, seemed to be moving away, as if the process of its identification had been postponed indefinitely. The man who was serving the girls the bowls addressed the red-haired girl with a soothing tone. He said that she should not worry, as she had already been tested and her position was now confirmed. His words were supposed to console the girl a little,